They say that when a bomb goes off, you feel it before you hear it. The explosives create a shockwave that pushes walls inwards, disintegrates glass, compresses air, and for a brief moment, there's just silence. Then you hear it. A blast so loud it can rupture eardrums. After the explosion, the aftermath of a bomb follows a familiar pattern. Sifting through the rubble, counting the dead, the hunt for survivors, and finally, the search for a story. Something to make sense of the horror. Sometimes the story gives closure. Perpetrators are named, motivations identified. But then there are the stories that don't make sense. That lead to more questions than answers. From the BBC, this is the History Bureau, where we take journalists back to a story to ask, what did we miss the first time round? It's a second draft of history. And for this, our first season, we're digging into a story that the world may have been getting wrong for years. It's about a bomb. In fact, 4 bombs. 4 bombs that blew up 4 apartments across Russia in 1999, killing some 300 people.
The entire country felt under siege.
There were people screaming, just utterly traumatized.
Children were terrified. Adults were patrolling round the clock.
And these bombs, and everything that followed, have sparked some chilling theories about who was behind them, because they set the stage for perhaps the most consequential rise to power in modern history.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
It's part of the origin story of Vladimir Putin.
It's something which explains Putin and the rise of Putin, or might do, and I think in that sense it's a mystery which matters.
I've been talking to journalists who were there in Russia during those brutal attacks. Journalists who've spent big chunks of their careers trying to figure out who killed all of those innocent people.
We are watching some kind of government conspiracy.
A lot of what we should know has been classified or buried or covered up.
If it really happened, it's a story for the ages.
The journalists we brought together for this series don't all agree about what happened.
It was quite clear that something very dirty is going on.
I would say that's a conspiracy theory. I've read the evidence, believe me.
I'm very, very wary of conspiracies. But when it comes to the Kremlin, they've often proved to be true.
But there's one thing they do agree on. Asking questions about this story, even now, can be dangerous.
He has been transferred to intensive care and he is on monitors. His immune system is gone.
It's a mystery some have died trying to solve.
We know their names, the people who've been killed. They all investigated the bombings. And that message has reached the Russian public as well.
And that message is?
That it's dangerous. Don't go there. You might end up dead.
I'm Helena Merriman, and we are going there in the History Bureau, Putin and the apartment bombs. Episode 1, The 4 Bombs.
One, two, three. Let me get to my Russian. Szła Sasha Pasha Sala Sushku. That's a nursery rhyme.
Is it?
Designed to make babies say sh.
Okay. What does it mean?
Sasha went along the road licking a lolly, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
So I'm Andrew Harding. Let me think about this. I arrived in Moscow in 1991, aged 24, thinking, let's go somewhere exciting to try and do this thing, be a foreign correspondent.
Why Russia?
I had a friend in Moscow and they allowed me to sleep on their floor. was incredibly dramatic. The Soviet Union was coming to an end. It was always in the news, and I was very interested in what was happening.
And it's quite a place to land. So this is 1991. Soviet Union is collapsing. You're in the middle of one of the biggest stories in the world. What was it like to experience that collapse happening in a day-to-day way?
It was so surreal, because you walk through the centre of Moscow and there are still these huge grey buildings with things like shoes and fruit written above them. No advertising, very Soviet, very communist. There was so much optimism and a desire to become part of the West. And all these foreign fast food outlets were coming, Pizza Hut, McDonald's, Snickers bars everywhere. Somebody coined the phrase snickerizatia, the snickerization of our country.
Andrew's been a BBC foreign correspondent for over 30 years. But through the years, his time in Russia in the 90s, it's always stuck with him. Even now, he's still trying to make sense of it. This wild, unpredictable decade that ended with the 4 bombs. And those bombs, we're about to get into them. But first, you have to understand the years that led up to them. This time in Russia when history was playing at double speed. So when Andrew arrives in Moscow in 91, the Berlin Wall's just fallen. The Soviet Empire collapsed, and he's living in a new country, Russia. A country that's just elected its first ever president.
Many votes are still to be counted, but there is no doubt that Boris Yeltsin has become the first president of the Russian
Boris
Federation
Yeltsin.
to be elected.
And at first, people love him. He's flamboyant, charismatic. He says he's going to shake things up, ditch the old Soviet economy, embrace capitalism, and fast-track Russia into the 21st century. The problem was, Yeltsin went too far, too fast. Shock therapy, he called it. He freed prices overnight. Inflation soared to over 2,000%. And the result? People's savings were wiped.
The old people, the pensioners, started to come out of their apartments and sell everything they had on the icy, snowy streets of Moscow. And they would be sitting there all day in these big fur coats, or if they'd sold their fur coats, in thinner coats and hats, and people would walk past in the slush. It was really wretched and made a huge impression on me.
The Russian ruble collapsed, and suddenly the only thing that mattered was dollars. And that changed everything. The jobs you could get, the places you could eat.
Restaurants didn't want to let you in unless you had dollars.
So you'd have to sort of queue up
So
outside?
you'd literally do a $5 handshake with the doorman.
To bribe your way in.
Which was, a source of great pride. I bribed my way in somewhere. It felt very dramatic. And once you were inside, for another $5, you could eat and drink all night. For $5, you could fly 9 time zones to the far edge near Alaska. The dollar was extraordinary. And of course, most people didn't have access to that.
Most people, except for a new breed of businessmen, the oligarchs. They got very rich very fast, buying up former state-owned companies at knockdown prices. And as they got richer, they moved into politics, funneling money to Yeltsin, helping to keep him in power. But as Yeltsin and the oligarchs scavenged on Russia, the rest of the country was getting poorer. And by the late 90s, people had had enough. Where Russians had once lined the streets to support Yeltsin, now they wanted him gone. And Yeltsin, he was falling apart.
Last week, President Yeltsin arrived a little unsteadily at a press conference. He's long had a reputation for boozing.
By the last few years of the 90s, Yeltsin was a shadow of himself.
Yeltsin's hope for another term in office won't survive his latest illness.
He was a sort of shabby, pathetic figure, really. Drunk, often. When he wasn't drunk, he looked like he might be. Clearly struggling with his health. He spoke painfully slowly.
What would Russians say to you when you interviewed them about this, about him?
They would say, we need somebody new. And every time he went in for an operation, it was this huge drama, because would he survive the operation? Who does he hand the nuclear briefcase to? Who can he trust to be there when he comes round from anaesthetic?
The problem was, Yeltsin had no obvious successor, and he was terrified that the next president might turn on him, take up one of the corruption scandals surrounding him and his family, and throw him in prison. The oligarchs were nervous too. They needed a new protector, someone who'd keep the money flowing.
These were gangs, essentially, competing for power. The stakes were incredibly high.
And what were they after, power or money or both?
Well, the two were sort of came hand in hand in a way. It was a real cowboy capitalism, and it was very, very dangerous.
And so by the autumn of 99, you have a country with a failing president, no clear successor, and powerful men operating in the shadows, searching for a new leader they can trust. And it's at this point, on September the 4th, that our story begins. It all starts in a town in southwest Russia, Buynaksk. It's remote, thousands of miles from Moscow, surrounded by mountains. And lining its streets, as in so many Russian cities, is a smattering of grey, identical buildings, Russia's apartment blocks. There's one apartment right next to a Russian military base. 5 floors, small flats, kitchens just big enough for a table and 2 chairs, and TV sets, which tonight are showing a football match, a qualifier for Euro 2000, Russia versus Armenia. And the game? It's a good one for Russia. They win 2-0. After the game, some of the families stay up to watch the news. Others bed down for the night. This is when the apartment is at its fullest. And this is when it happens. A truck parked outside the apartment explodes. Windows shatter. The building catches fire. And one by one, the 5 floors collapse. Soon the firefighters come, then the ambulances, and then...
From Russia, Andrew Harding reports.
The journalists, like Andrew Harding.
Southern Russia is in turmoil tonight. Rescue workers have spent the day searching for survivors in this mound of rubble. It's all that remains of a block of flats torn apart by a massive car bomb. This 10-year-old girl was dragged from the ruins, both legs crushed.
It takes a few days to find all the bodies in the rubble. The final count, 64. Men, women and children.
It's not clear yet what caused the blast, but the finger of suspicion is likely to point towards a group of militants who've been trying to drive Russian forces out of the region.
This first bomb makes the news, but only briefly. The explosion happened in a remote city near Chechnya, where militants in the Russian military have fought for years. So it's a tragic story, but it seems like more of the same, and the country moves on. A few days pass. It's now the 9th of September.
I was at home in my apartment in southern Moscow, and I remember getting the call.
There'd been a second bomb, another apartment blown up. This second bomb explodes in the early hours of the morning, when most people are asleep. But this time, it's not in a remote, war-torn part of the country. It's in the heart of Russia, in Moscow.
I remember rushing off with a cameraman, Bob, from the bureau, and heading off to, I think, southeast suburbs. And we arrived at this giant pile of rubble. There were already police, and there were these crowds around, people scrabbling in the dirt, people screaming, people just utterly traumatized. Everybody from the neighborhood was there, a lot of them in their dressing gowns.
Could you see the insides of apartments?
There were some places I do remember where the front peeled off. It was almost like a doll's house. So you could see inside, and you could see the layers that had been compressed as well.
Rescue workers are continuing to hunt for survivors beneath the smouldering rubble. but hopes of finding anyone else alive are now fading.
In Russian news footage, you see firefighters in black uniforms. They're kneeling in the rubble, prizing apart slabs of concrete as they search for bodies. Suddenly you see an arm, then a face, then an eye that twitches. This man is still alive. The firefighters scoop out the rubble around him, heave him into their arms, and they carry him away. He's naked, except for a pair of green underpants.
I remember the dust, and I remember the smell. There was just a mood of hysteria. You know, Russians were used to a certain degree of chaos. They were used to mafia hits. They were used to all sorts of things. But this was not something that anybody in the city had seen.
Again, the counting begins. 94 dead. And this time, with Moscow hit, the story breaks out. It's on every front page, every TV bulletin, every radio show. And the question everyone's asking, who did this?
Our correspondent Andrew Harding is in Moscow.
Within days, people think they know who's to blame.
Andrew, have the authorities there actually nailed the cause of this explosion? Is it now beyond doubt?
Well, various obvious possibilities have sprung to everyone's mind, and the leading candidate is the Islamic militants, the Chechens, who are now fighting against Russian troops in the south of the country.
All over Russia, people are blaming them. Chechen militants. And this was a terrifying thought for Russians, because if the Chechen militants had bombed 2 buildings already, then maybe they'd do it again.
They have promised to wage the campaign against the Russians in every major city, including Moscow. And this is
it was almost instinctive for people because they were the ones who Russia had been at war with.
And that war between Chechnya and the Russian state had been so brutal that people thought it could be reason enough for Chechen militants to blow up apartments full of Russian civilians. It all goes back to 1991. The Soviet Union was falling apart, different states breaking free and declaring independence. And Chechnya, a republic in the south of Russia, wanted that too. It was partly about identity. Most Chechens are Muslim, but it was also about decades of brutal treatment by Russian leaders. So Chechnya declared independence, but Russia had no intention of letting Chechnya go.
The Russians moved in at first light this morning.
And they sent in the tanks.
Hundreds of tanks and armoured personnel carriers crossed the border, backed up by helicopters.
The Chechens responded with sort of classic provocative swagger and said, "Come and get us. We are Chechen. We are not afraid of this superpower army."
It was the first conflict Andrew ever covered.
I think my first visit would have been in the summer of 1994. And I would have driven over the mountains in my little Lada Niva Jeep. I was just in love with this.
How did it deal with the rocky mountains?
Amazingly, because it sort of bounced over everything. It was very light. The Soviet joke was that this was the thing that the Soviet industry invented instead of fixing the roads. They came up with this amazing...
small but mighty car.
...that could drive over everything.
He drove all over the country meeting Chechen fighters.
Chechnya was overrun by warlords, armed to the teeth, just bristling with weapons. And we really had no idea what we were doing. I mean, we'd never covered anything like this.
He was there when the tanks rolled in, when Chechen women walked into the streets to try and stop them. And he was there in the capital, Grozny, when Russia tried to destroy the city.
The war for Grozny was just hell on earth. It was the most intense bombardments on a big city. And I, to this day, have never been more scared of anything.
And you've covered a lot of wars in your time.
It was insane. This was Russia's superpower ex-Soviet military with every imaginable missile, mortar, bombs, jets, helicopters, all targeting this city and pulverizing. I mean, the word is appropriate.
The war dragged on for 2 years. Thousands of Chechen civilians were killed, and there were reports of horrific abuses on both sides. It ended with a peace deal, but the Chechens didn't win their independence. So there was a sense of unfinished business, that a day of reckoning would come.
They kept that resentment, that anger against Moscow. It burned and it still burns.
And that anger in Chechnya, it became a fertile place for a new kind of extremism.
After all the bloodshed and all the chaos and misery of the First War, you could start to see a more militant Islamism starting to come in, starting to fund people, more shadowy figures emerging with their own power centres.
Chechen militants started taking hostages, aid workers, journalists, anyone they thought could bring in money or attention. And in one particularly brutal case, they kidnapped 4 foreign engineers. A few months on, their bodies were found, dumped by a roadside. All 4 had been decapitated. So when those first 2 bombs explode in 1999, this is why most Russians blame Chechen militants. And in the news reports, you can hear a deeper fear that this might just be the beginning.
So are you saying that Russia is bracing itself now for some kind of wave of terrorist attacks from this source?
I think that it's quite likely that that's going to happen.
As long as neighbouring Chechnya remains in a state of near anarchy, more turmoil in the region seems almost inevitable.
And sure enough,
the blast happened before dawn as the building's 150 residents lay sleeping.
Only a few nights later, at 5 in the morning on the 13th of September,
an entire apartment block collapsed, leaving a scene of utter devastation. The death toll is rising by the minute. Rescuers
the third bomb explodes, again in Moscow. It's the third one to tear down an apartment in just 9 days. And now, the panic sets in.
Russian police patrol the streets of Moscow. Yesterday's deadly explosion has triggered a massive security clampdown here. Every nook and cranny is being searched.
In Russia, almost everyone lives in these tall, precarious prefab concrete apartments. And with the bombs exploding in the middle of the night, people are now too scared to sleep.
There was a sense that this is going to carry on, that we're all at risk now. People began to patrol every apartment block where they could to make sure it didn't happen to them the next night.
That night, Russia's latest prime minister, the 5th in 18 months, talks to the press. For most Russians, this is the first time they've ever seen their new prime minister speak. He's only been in the job a few weeks. He's short, a forgettable face, and the only thing most people know about him is that he was, until very recently, the head of the FSB, Russia's internal security service, formerly the KGB. His name? Vladimir Putin. With President Boris Yeltsin nowhere to be seen, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has stepped into the light.
Russia's Prime Minister Vladimir Putin blamed Islamic militants for the attack and said that Russian forces would wipe out their bases in Chechnya.
Putin offers comfort, but he also offers revenge. Says he'll go after the rabid animals who did this. Then, 3 days later, at 5 in the morning,
Volgodonsk in southern Russia hasn't experienced anything like it since the Second World War.
the 4th bomb explodes, demolishing an apartment building in Volgodonsk, a city hundreds of kilometers away from Moscow. It rips the facade off a 9-story building.
Someone, somewhere in Russia is doing this, but no one knows who or why.
Once again, people are killed as they sleep. 2 are children.
The police are flooding the streets. In the battle to beat the bombers, no stone is being left unturned. The building destroyed this morning had only been checked yesterday. Nowhere now is safe, nothing beyond suspicion.
At this point, all 4 of the bombs have gone off. Over a period of just 16 days, 4 apartments have been blown up, killing some 300 people. But then, this story takes a strange turn, one that people have been puzzling over ever since, because there's a 5th bomb.
I remember this extraordinary news coming through that another bomb had been found in another apartment block. And then I remember it seemed almost instantaneous that there was a twist, just the worst possible twist.
And this 5th bomb, it doesn't explode. People find it, they call the police. And the police, they follow the trail. A trail which ends up not with Chechen militants, but with the FSB, the Russian government security service, formerly known as the KGB.
If it's true, it changes what Russia's sense of itself is. It changes everything.
If it's true. Because the story of this 5th bomb is contested. 25 years later, people are still arguing about it. But at the time, like so many Western journalists, Andrew didn't report on this twist. With so much going on, a bomb that didn't go off, well, it didn't feel like a priority.
I think it's very difficult it's quite painful to confront that failure. All I can say is I think we should have done. We should have covered it more, and we didn't.
But a few journalists did.
The bombings were extremely suspicious. My premonition was that there was something very, very sinister going on.
Next time on Putin and the apartment bombs.
The problem is a problem of imagination. It's so evil, so horrible, so outside the normal comprehension of people. You have to believe the unbelievable. Once you understand that the impossible is really possible, everything makes perfect sense. But how many people, how many journalists, how many diplomats, how many political leaders are equipped to believe the unbelievable?
The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown. When we started researching this story, we made a list of everyone we wanted to talk to. Most were Russian, but for reasons that will become clear, most of them wouldn't talk to us. We'd reach out, they'd reply, and then the moment we mentioned our subject, the 1999 apartment bombs, they'd go quiet. But there's one person everyone said we should talk to. Okay.
Are we okay?
Yeah. Someone who spent his life trying to figure out what happened in those 2 weeks that changed Russia. Is David close enough to the microphone? Would you like him to be a little bit closer? He's called David Satter. What was it that drew you to working in the Soviet Union?
Well, if the question is what drew me to Russia and the Soviet Union, you have to go back literally to my childhood.
David was one of those nerdy kids who was just interested in Russia as a hobby. He grew up in the 60s, remembers his parents talking about the Cold War around the kitchen table, and decided to learn Russian.
I knew it that only a very restricted number of people from the West were even able to go to the Soviet Union and spend time there. And I never dreamed at that time, when I was 13 years old, that one day I would be one of them.
David started working in Russia in the 70s as a journalist for the Financial Times. So he'd been writing about Russia for 20 years by the time of the bombs in September 1999.
It was obvious that someone was blowing up residential apartment blocks and killing people in the middle of the night to inspire terror.
The blast happened before dawn as the building's 150 residents lay sleeping. An entire apartment block collapsed.
In just 12 days, 4 apartments had been bombed, some 300 people killed.
There was no warning and no escape for those caught inside. Whole families wiped out as they slept.
No one had taken responsibility for the attacks, but the government blamed Chechen militants.
Russia's Prime Minister Vladimir Putin blamed Islamic militants for the attack and said that Russian forces would wipe out their bases in Chechnya.
And because all the bombs had gone off at night, killing people as they slept, all over Russia people were now sleeping outside on the streets, hoping they'd be safer there.
A people left bewildered, distrustful and scared.
Suddenly, people throughout Moscow and throughout Russia feared of being blown up in their beds. And that had a huge psychological effect. The entire country felt it was under siege.
As night falls in the housing estates of Moscow, there's an almost palpable sense of fear and helplessness.
The country is in a state of total terror. Police are being inundated with calls from worried people reporting suspicious activity. Police departments everywhere are on edge. And this is true also of the city of Ryazan.
Ryazan. It's a city about 100 kilometers southeast of Moscow. And it's here, just a few days after the 4th bomb explodes, that something weird happens. The twist Andrew Harding mentioned at the end of episode 1. A twist that challenges the story that Putin's been telling about the bombs and that David Satter has spent his life trying to unravel. I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 2, Sugar. Now, this twist, this 5th bomb, is where the ground starts to shift. It's the most contested part of the story, where the disagreements over what happened grow the loudest. And it's one of the hardest parts of the story to report. So here's how we're going to tell it. Every fact you hear from our reporters, we've checked against multiple independent sources. And where something can't be confirmed, we'll say so, clearly. So let's get into it. It's evening on September the 22nd, 1999, 6 days after the 4th bomb. And in the city of Ryazan, like everywhere else in Russia, people are patrolling their apartments, keeping watch. Volunteers are taking shifts, stopping anyone who looks suspicious. Everyone is on high alert. And then,
at about 9:30, a man by the name of Alexei Kartofelnikov noticed some very strange activity.
Alexei is on his way home from work when he spots a white Lada car parked outside his apartment. But there's something odd about it.
The last 2 numbers of the license plate were covered up with a piece of paper, which was very suspicious.
Alexei stands there watching the car when suddenly he sees a man burst out of the basement of the apartment
and rush into the car.
So Alexei calls the police.
At first, the police were not interested. They were getting lots of calls of suspicious activity, and they couldn't answer all of them.
Alexei keeps calling, and the police eventually come. But there's a hitch.
They didn't want to go into the basement because it had been used as a toilet by local derelicts.
Oh, so it stank.
Yeah, it stank. But they insisted, and the police went down there. And
what did they find?
Well, they bolted back up the steps and said there's a bomb in the building. And the entire building was evacuated.
Which must have been quite a scene.
Yes. People left in their bedclothes. Babies were removed from bathtubs.
In the panic, some people are left behind. People too weak or ill to leave the apartment. Those who make it downstairs stand outside, shivering in their pajamas and nightgowns. The police then call for backup and track down a local explosives expert. They go into the basement and they find 3 white sacks of powder connected to a detonator and a timer. They test the powder.
And tested positive for hexagon.
Hexagon, a military explosive, the same type that was used in at least one of the other apartment bombs. Outside, the residents are still gathered in the cold, waiting for news. The owner of a nearby cinema invites them inside, gives them hot tea. And it's then that they hear what the police have found. A bomb, programmed to explode at 5 a.m, the same time as the previous 2 bombs.
And you can imagine the atmosphere in the movie theater at 5 a.m. as everyone in that theater understood they would have been dead if that bomb had not been discovered.
That morning, the people of Ryazan wake up to the news. A bomb found, and a city saved. Alexei, the man who spotted the suspicious car, has become a hero, the saviour of Ryazan. The head of the local FSB, Russia's internal security service, even comes to meet the residents. They're now back at their apartment, standing outside in their pyjamas while it's searched for evidence. He congratulates them for being so vigilant, says they should think of today as their second birthday. Meanwhile, a manhunt has begun.
Ryazan is literally under siege. People everywhere are looking for the bombers. Not just the FSB and the local police, but residents as well. All of the roads out of the city were blocked. The trains were blocked. The same thing for the airport.
Alexei talks to the police, gives them descriptions of the people he saw, and they draw sketches of the suspects.
Photos were placed in every store window in Ryazan, and especially next to the cash registers, so that if any one of the bombers tried to buy food, the cashier might recognize them.
And then, a few hours later, a call comes into the Ryazan phone exchange. A man at a payphone wants to be connected to a number outside the city. The operator puts it through. Then she does something she's not meant to do. She listens in. So she hears this phone call.
Here's this phone call, and a male voice said that the entire city is locked down. We can't get out.
The voice on the other end tells the men to split up, to leave the city immediately. Then the line goes dead. The operator sits there, stunned. In the middle of a manhunt for the bombers, someone inside Ryazan is trying to escape. She scribbles down the number and passes it to the local police.
The local police said, well, thank God we've got the number. This is the number of the terrorists. And so they called on the number.
And they guess it's going to be a Chechen militant at the other end?
Well, they thought it would be someone who, one way or another, was connected to them.
Mm-hmm. They trace the number and...
Turns out it's the FSB.
So it goes back to an FSB number?
Yeah, well, the people picking up are the FSB.
So the people trying to escape the manhunt in Ryazan have just made a phone call, not to Chechnya, but to a number belonging to the FSB, Russia's own internal security service. That same day, police find the white car with a dodgy license plate abandoned in a parking lot. And then they track down 2 men who look just like the police sketches of the bombers, and they arrest them. And here's where things get even weirder. After they're arrested, the 2 men say, "We're not the bombers, we're FSB." They even take out their ID cards to prove it.
The FSB arrives, takes custody of them,
and takes the 2 men away. Okay, so to recap this very confusing picture. First, sacks of white powder turn up in the basement of an apartment, full of hexagon, a military explosive. Then a telephone operator overhears a suspicious phone call, one that leads straight to the FSB. And the 2 people the police pick up? Well, they too are connected to the FSB. But it isn't until 2 days later that the government finally makes an announcement about this 5th bomb. It's now mid-morning on September 24th. And in Moscow, in a conference room near the Kremlin, Russia's interior minister is preparing to speak. The room's packed, filled with police and government officials. The interior minister stands there in front of a red velvet curtain. And he starts listing proudly all the police's recent successes in the fight against terrorism. Eventually he comes to Ryazan, says he's proud that people there stopped the bombers. And that's it. The speech is over. There's no mention of the intercepted phone call or the men with the FSB ID cards, the ones who look just like the police sketches of the bombers. And then there's a 30-minute gap. A gap that people will puzzle over for years to come, and that changes the direction of this story forever. Half an hour after the Interior Minister's speech, the head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, appears in the lobby of the same building. He's just come out of an emergency government meeting about the bombs. A Russian journalist spots Patrushev, asks him about Ryazan, and Patrushev, he says something that completely contradicts what the Interior Minister said just half an hour ago. Patrushev says there was no bomb. This wasn't a terrorist attack, he says. It was a training exercise, a drill organised by the FSB. The white powder in the sacks? It wasn't hexagon. It was sugar. He says the FSB staged similar drills all over Russia to make sure people were paying attention, a test that only the people of Ryazan passed.
What was your reaction to hearing them saying it was a training exercise?
It was absurd. That was absolutely absurd.
But the FSB stick with their story. What happened in Ryazan was a shining success, they say. A success for the FSB who planned the training exercise, and a success for the residents who spotted the fake bomb.
Some people were even given prizes for vigilance. The telephone operator who reported the telephone call was given a color television as a prize.
But despite the prizes, few people in Ryazan believe it was a drill. Not the residents, not even the local FSB. But a few days later, something shifts. The local FSB changed their story, now echoing the official line from Moscow. Now they say it was just a training exercise. They explained that the bomb squad mistook the sugar for hexagon because its testing equipment was contaminated after being used in Chechnya. So, to summarise, in just over 2 weeks, 4 apartments have been blown up in Russia, some 300 people killed. And now this, a thwarted bomb, which the FSB says was just a training exercise. It's a lot to take in for the people of Russia. And you'd expect questions like, why would a security service plan training exercises in the middle of these deadly terror attacks? And why did they wait 48 hours to tell anyone about it? But these questions get sidelined because something else is happening. Something that's taken the attention off Ryazan.
Misery returns to Chechnya. Just 3 years after its war with Russia, the fighter bombers are back.
The day after the strange events in Ryazan, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin gives the order. Russian fighter jets are to bomb Chechnya. 3 years after the First War ended, the Second Chechen War has officially begun.
Moscow says it's targeting what it calls bandits, the Islamic rebels it holds responsible for the recent spate of bomb blasts in Russia's cities. But it's ordinary Chechens who are dying. And
journalists at the time draw a direct connection between the apartment bombs and this new war. Footage streams into news bulletins all over the world. Villages on fire. pictures of dead Chechen civilians killed by bombs from above. Already, this second war seems more brutal than the first. Then the next day, Vladimir Putin appears on TV. Wearing a suit, looking straight into the camera, Putin says he's going to track the terrorists down, wherever they are. Then he slams his hands on the table and says, if we find them in the toilet, we will catch them and wipe them out there. It's a new kind of speech from Russia's new prime minister. Blunt, aggressive, street fighter talk. And Russians seem to love it. Slowly but surely, Putin's approval ratings creep up. And soon Putin's image changes. He swaps his boardroom suits for military uniform, jumping into helicopters and planes, giving heart-thumping speeches to Russian soldiers fighting in Chechnya.
And suddenly this totally inconspicuous guy who had the charisma of a lizard was everywhere.
Remember, only a few weeks back, people hardly knew anything about Vladimir Putin.
He had no previous political career in that he had never run for office. He was considered kind of a gray mouse. In Russian, we would say Syria Mishka, just somebody totally insignificant. Unnoticeable, basically. Someone who would be good for surveillance because you would never pick him out of a crowd.
As the fifth prime minister in just 18 months, no one thought he'd last. But now, it seems he's here to stay. At this time of national tragedy, after the bombs, Putin stepped up, become the leader many Russians seem to want. A man of action and revenge. And as Putin's popularity soars, in the background, journalists are scrambling to find out more about him, to understand why Boris Yeltsin picked him, this obscure figure who'd spent most of his career in the shadows, working for Russia's security service. And they uncover a story that might explain things. It goes back to a few months before the bombs, to this moment when Yeltsin, Russia's once-loved president, was looking for someone to replace him. He was getting older, drinking more, and he was surrounded by corruption scandals involving him and the oligarchs, the businessmen he protected through his presidency. Yeltsin's great fear was that his successor might one day turn on him, investigate one of these corruption scandals, maybe send him to prison. And if anyone was going to uncover the truth about Yeltsin's corruption, it was a man called Yuri Skaratov.
So Yuri Skaratov was the prosecutor general, and he was digging into some cases close to the Yeltsins.
Here's the BBC's Andrew Harding, who you heard from in episode 1.
And he didn't seem to be getting the message that maybe these weren't the cases he should focus on.
One night on Russian state TV, a newsreader announces they have something to show, something involving the prosecutor general. In fact, they're clearing the schedule for it. Viewers are warned the footage isn't suitable for anyone under 18. A video starts playing. It's the prosecutor general, but not as the Russian public are used to seeing him. He's naked, and he's in bed with 2 women. It's a sex tape, a long one.
I mean, it wasn't just 5 edited, discrete minutes showing a man with 2 prostitutes and everyone could get the impression. It was the whole tape.
A whole 55 minutes of airtime.
There was no blurring. It was an entire long sex session between this slightly aging, balding, portly gentleman and 2 younger women.
A sex session broadcast to the whole of Russia.
I interviewed Skaratov soon after this, and he understood that was a kind of revenge hit to try and sway him from some of the prosecutions that he was investigating. Somebody incredibly powerful had taken the tape, sent their minion to the TV station and late at night persuaded somebody to put it on. And who could that have been? The suspicion was that it possibly was Vladimir Putin, and that this was a way of demonstrating loyalty to Yeltsin.
The day after the sex tape was broadcast, Putin, then head of the FSB, gave a press conference, said the video was real. So did Putin set up the sting operation? Perhaps. But like a lot of things in Putin's backstory, we don't know for sure. What is clear is that somehow Putin had earned Yeltsin's trust. And now, 6 months later, as Prime Minister, Putin is reinventing himself.
And suddenly, instead of being seen as a corrupt crony of Yeltsin's, he was recast as the defender of the country, the defender of innocent Russian people who had been the victims of a perfidious terrorist attack.
How quickly do his approval ratings change? Do they go from...
Dramatically, because he was on television constantly, vowing revenge.
Back in August, before the bombs, only 2% of Russians thought Putin would make a good president. Now, just a few months later, after the bombs, the new war in Chechnya, and Putin being all over the news, his ratings have soared to over 40%. It's now early October, a few weeks after the bombs. People in Russia are now sleeping back in their beds. But there's still a sense of unease. And although the world's media has now shifted its attention to the new war in Chechnya, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about the bombs. And under the radar, a few journalists are starting their own investigations, trying to get to the truth.
My premonition was that there was something very, very sinister going on.
Journalist David Satter had been calling his contacts, people with links to Russia's security services, trying to find out more. And tonight, in the light autumn rain, he's following a lead. He makes his way through central Moscow, past Red Square, and up to the top floor of a department store to meet two men, both former members of the security services.
We walked down to the end of a corridor and looked out the windows at the lights of the Bolshoi Theater in the city. We stood there for a long time, and I tried to absorb everything that they were telling me.
Did you make notes?
No. I didn't want to attract any attention. And I didn't want to tape anything, because that would have been awkward too, and possibly would have compromised them if those tapes fell into the wrong hands. But I committed everything to memory.
David talks to his sources for around an hour. They tell him they don't buy the official story that Ryazan was a drill, or that the apartment bombs were plotted by Chechen militants.
For one thing, it didn't make sense for the Chechens to bomb a working-class neighborhood. If the Chechens had been responsible, they would have bombed official buildings or the homes of the rich.
The men question how Chechen militants would have got their hands on hexagon, the explosive used in at least one of the bombs.
Because hexagon was produced only in a single factory, which was tightly guarded by the FSB.
And they mention something else. How the Russian authorities demolished the remains of the apartment blocks just days after the explosions,
which effectively destroyed the crime scene. This would never have happened if they were interested seriously to investigate who was responsible for the bombings.
And the two men are clear about who they think plotted the bombs. It wasn't Chechen militants, they say. It was the FSB. David stands there, taking it all in, unsure what to do with this information. It's hard to know what to make of it, even now. To be clear, I don't know who David's sources were. I can't call them up and confirm their story. I don't know how much to trust their specific claims. What we do know is that back in 1999, when David speaks to these men, their theory that the apartment bombs were an FSB plot was not mainstream thinking. There were hints of it in the Russian press, a few whispers of speculation. But in the Western press, almost nothing. It sounded too far-fetched, too much like a conspiracy theory.
I went back to my apartment and leafed through the press coverage of the bombings, including an article in Moskovsky Komsomolets, one of the biggest Moscow newspapers, which showed a picture of the apartment building with the lights on and photos of people whose lives had been snuffed out in these bombings. And I read over the biographies one by one, and I realized I had to do this. I realized I had to write something.
David sits down and starts writing. He lays out everything he's learned. The unanswered questions, the inconsistencies, the whispers from his sources. Then he calls a contact at the Washington Times, a small but influential paper back then, with a circulation of around 100,000. He pitches the story, and they say yes. It takes him all night, but by dawn, the piece is finished. He calls it Anatomy of a Murder. And in it, he says the apartment bombs weren't plotted by Chechen militants, but by the FSB. Then, just before he sends it, he pauses. He has no idea what the consequences of writing this could be.
I hesitated for a long time and then just pushed send.
And then he steels himself for what might come. Let's track to the end of the year. It's end of 1999, 31st of December. Just paint a picture of that moment.
So it's the millennium.
Here's the BBC's Andrew Harding again.
It's the millennium bug. The Americans are terrified. I heard a rumour that they'd replaced the swimming pool water with drinkable water because they were so worried that the millennium bug was going to stop everything. And then in the afternoon of New Year's Eve, completely out of the blue, nobody saw it coming.
Russian President Boris Yeltsin has resigned. He was due to leave office next June, but says he's going now because he's done everything he can for his people. Mr. Yeltsin...
The news came of Yeltsin stepping down.
I want to ask for your forgiveness, because many of our dreams did not come to pass, because what had seemed simple turned out to be terribly hard.
Sitting in the Kremlin, in a surprise lunchtime broadcast, Yeltsin gives an emotional speech to the people of Russia.
I ask forgiveness for not fulfilling some of the hopes of the people who believed that we could in one swoop, in one leap, jump from the grey, stagnant, totalitarian past into the radiant, wealthy, and civilized future. I am leaving. I have done everything I can.
Waiting in the wings in the Kremlin, as Yeltsin gives his final speech, Vladimir Putin.
New elections will be held in 3 months. Until then, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin will be acting president. Mr. Putin has already taken control of the nuclear briefcase. By stepping down now and calling early elections, Mr. Yeltsin has made Mr. Putin almost unbeatable.
Thank you very much, Vladimir Putin said, casually accepting the leadership of the world's largest country.
In Russian news footage from that day, you see Putin and Yeltsin walk out of the Kremlin together. Yeltsin is trussed up in a long coat and fur hat, looking bloated. Putin, in contrast, looks wiry, youthful. The two men shake hands. Yeltsin then tells Putin to take care of Russia before he climbs into a car and disappears into the snow. It's now just a few hours before the millennium, this strange moment in history when some people thought the world might end. And on the streets of Moscow, the celebrations have begun.
Snow was coming down, people were letting off firecrackers drunkenly in their hands. There was a sort of extra rowdy atmosphere on Red Square. It was looking particularly beautiful.
Across Russia, families are gathering. Some praying for those they lost in the bombs, or for sons and fathers fighting in Chechnya. Others praying that the world as they know it won't end at midnight. Then, as the clock chimes 12, they switch on their televisions.
Tonight, Vladimir Putin made his first presidential address at midnight, a new face for the new millennium. There will be no power vacuum, he said. There was a warning, too.
And their world has changed, just not in the way they thought. The change isn't instant. In fact, it takes a while to sink in.
It was only a few weeks later that people came back from their holidays and their hangovers, and the new year began, and suddenly, fait accompli. There was Putin, Yeltsin had disappeared, and we were in the Putin era.
On the front pages of newspapers all over the world, Putin's face looks out, strong, defiant. There are long articles musing about what kind of leader he'll be. But the story of the apartment bombs and Ryazan, mostly forgotten in the swirl of events. And the article David Satter wrote for the Washington Times, suggesting the FSB were behind the bombs, well, the paper took his piece, published it, and now 2 months had gone by.
And what was the reaction?
No reaction.
Nothing?
No. None whatsoever.
And let's be clear, so at this point you're the first Western journalist to be writing an article which is pointing the finger at the FSB.
Right.
And this is the first piece that has appeared in the Western press.
Yeah.
And there is no reaction.
None whatever.
Of course, David's piece, at the time he wrote it, back in October 99, was just one article, a drop in the ocean of Russia coverage that was mostly focused on the Chechen war. But what's striking is that this idea that the FSB might somehow be involved in the bombs, almost no one picks it up in the Western press.
Okay, why?
Because people prefer to sleep well, and the less they know, the better they sleep.
Do you think people just thought it was too preposterous?
It was too unbelievable.
Too unbelievable for the Western press, perhaps. But in Russia, it's a different story. Next time on Putin and the apartment bombs. While Western reporters move on to other stories, Russian journalists keep digging. And a TV network does the unthinkable. It convinces the FSB to take part in a special show, answering questions directly from the residents of the Ryazan apartment where the bomb was found. And the show? Well, let's just say for the FSB, it doesn't go as planned.
He warned us that this program will never be forgotten. They will never forgive you for this.
The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown. It's Friday, 10th of March, 7 months since the apartment bombs that killed some 300 people. And inside the Mariinsky Theatre, Russia's famous opera house, the orchestra is tuning up. It's a 1,000-seat theatre packed with men in black tie, women in silk dresses, and they're all looking in one direction, towards the presidential box. There's a pause, and then you see him. A short man with thinning hair in suit and tie. Vladimir Putin, now walking to his seat. When Putin arrives at the presidential box, he puffs out his chest, drinking it all in. It's a big moment, because next to him is another man, British Prime Minister Tony Blair. He's the first Western leader to meet Putin since Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned on New Year's Eve. And Tony Blair's not the only Western leader courting Putin. American President Bill Clinton has already described him as someone the US can do business with. The West is in full schmooze, and that matters because all this attention, the photo ops, the handshakes, it sends a message. Putin's one of them, a legitimate world leader. Remember, at this point, Putin is still only acting president. In 2 weeks, Russians will go to the polls to decide whether Putin keeps the job. Back in the summer, when no one knew who he was, Putin's approval ratings for the presidency were just 2%, hardly a viable candidate. But then, after the 4 apartment bombs, everything changed. He became the face of the government's response, launching the second war in Chechnya. And by now, in early March 2000, his ratings have soared to 53%. Better, but not guaranteed. The opera begins. It's Prokofiev's War and Peace. As Putin and Blair sit inside the theatre, watching this opera about the horrors of war, outside the theatre, protesters are shouting about a very real war, the one Russia is waging right now in Chechnya. Men in leather jackets are waving peace signs, pumping fists, and ripping Putin's election posters. They're furious that Blair's visit might help Putin win. A moment later, a bus pulls up. Men in military uniforms jump out, drag protesters on board. It's clear someone high up doesn't want this protest to continue, to disrupt Putin's looming election. But what Putin and his backers don't realise is that right now, in a Moscow newsroom, journalists are preparing something far more threatening than a protest. A TV show. One that will pull at the loose threads in the government story about the apartment bombs and expose to millions of Russians just how fragile that story is. I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau. Putin and the apartment bombs. Episode 3, the TV show.
Okay, let me start from the beginning. My name is Yevgeny Kiselyov, and I'm a journalist.
Yevgeny Kiselyov is one of Russia's most famous political journalists. These days, he lives outside the country, which is partly why he can speak to us. For journalists in Russia, talking about the apartment bombs is dangerous. And because of that, most of the journalists in Russia we approached turned us down.
Well, I'm a lifelong critic of Mr. Putin, and lifelong critics of Mr. Putin never feel safe these days.
But Yevgeny agreed to talk, to tell us about the dramatic way he got caught up in everything that happened after the apartment bombs.
Let's go back to the summer of 1999. What were you doing at the time? What was your job? And just how would you describe yourself?
In 1999, I was one of the top editorial managers of NTV. And NTV at that time was probably the most influential independent private television channel in Russia.
NTV was founded a few years earlier, broadly modelled on the BBC and CNN. It was the first Russian network to make Western-style discussion programmes and documentaries. Yevgeny had worked his way up, was now Director General of NTV, hosting his own weekly news show that set the agenda in Moscow.
Let me say that this program was somewhat bigger than life at that time.
And would people recognize you when you walked down the streets?
Yes, and attack me asking for autographs.
He's not exaggerating. Some NTV shows were watched by almost half the country. Take one of its most popular programmes, a satirical puppet show called Kukli, a bit like Britain's Spitting Image, or a puppet version of America's Saturday Night Live.
Every week there was a show that was laughing at some kind of fuck-up by one of the leading politicians. We satirized Putin a lot.
It was huge. In ratings, it was Russia's version of the American Super Bowl. Yeltsin put up with it for years. But Putin, he hated it. Possibly because since Putin had become acting president, every week, he was the star puppet. There's one episode we found. It's from a few months after the apartment bombs. It opens with a shot of Putin as a baby. He's being rocked gently by former President Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin is crying because baby Putin is so ugly. And his origins, Yeltsin says, are so dark. It's a riff on an old German story, where a fairy gives an ugly baby magical powers to make everyone think the baby is beautiful. All of the baby's evil deeds are blamed on others, but the baby gets the credit for everything good. Though in Kukli's version, the fairy who gives these powers to baby Putin is an oligarch, rich and powerful, pulling strings behind the scenes, quietly shaping Putin and the world around him. As the episode goes on, you see the bewitched baby Putin take power, everyone worshipping him, while all the time he's controlled by the oligarch fairy. It's almost unimaginable now, a show like this on Russian TV reaching half the country. And worse for Putin, this episode airs right in the middle of his presidential campaign. Putin's aides start pressuring NTV. They want the puppet destroyed. And NTV, they refuse. And not only do they keep the puppet, but they start digging into the apartment bombs, asking unsettling questions about who was behind them. At this point, how was NTV reporting the story?
We were openly skeptical. There were too many questions unanswered and too many dubious explanations.
Take the story the government told about Ryazan. Remember Ryazan? The city where residents saw people sneaking sacks of white powder into their apartment building and called the police. An explosives expert tested the powder, said it was hexagon, the same explosive used in at least one of the previous bombs. But then, in stepped the FSB, the Russian security service formerly known as the KGB, who said it was all just a training exercise. And the white powder? Not explosives, they said, but sugar. Now, many Russians were sceptical of the FSB's story, right from the start. But over time, those suspicions faded, and the country moved on. Then, a few months later, a Russian investigative reporter uncovered a story that cast doubt on the FSB's sugar explanation. This journalist tracked down 2 soldiers who'd been guarding an ammunition warehouse near Ryazan. The soldiers told the journalist how one day, in a moment of boredom, they'd broken into the warehouse and found dozens of sacks marked sugar. They'd cut a sack open and poured some of the powder into their tea, but it tasted terrible. So bad, they spat it out. The next day, their commander tested the white powder. It wasn't sugar, it was hexagon.
For most people who were capable of thinking and making 2 ends meet, it was quite clear that something very dirty is going on.
NTV now doubles down on the story of the apartment bombs, covering every new angle and lead. Then, one afternoon, in the corridors of NTV, an idea is hatched to make a special TV show all about that night in Ryazan, giving the residents of the apartment, that was apparently part of an FSB training exercise, the chance to ask questions directly to the FSB.
So the idea was to bring together the tenants of the house and some of the FSB officials who would explain to them why they had to undergo all that stress and on whose authority the so-called exercises were carried out.
So NTV puts in their request to the FSB, asking if they'll appear on the show. A few days later, the FSB replies. Astonishingly, they say yes. On the 23rd of March, just 3 days before the presidential election, across Russia, millions sit down to watch this special NTV show. It begins with a reenactment of that night in Ryazan. You see people removing sacks of explosives from a car, and a close-up of a hand on a timer and the car driving away. And then the camera cuts to the studio.
Место действия Рязань, время действия сентябрь 1990.
The NTV host, Nikolai Nikolaev, stands there in a beige suit, dark hair slicked back. Then the camera pans out, and you see them. Dozens of residents on one side of the room, FSB men in suits on the other. It all looks a bit like one of those tabloid daytime TV shows, like Jerry Springer, where a bunch of people are brought together to have it out in front of the cameras. But instead of, "Did you sleep with my husband?" it's, "Did you try to bomb my apartment?"
Алексей Картофельников присутствует сейчас здесь, в этой студии.
Right away, Nikolai reveals the star guest, Alexei Kartofelnikov, the Ryazan resident who spotted the car with a dodgy number plate. And they get straight into it.
I was coming back from the parking lot. I saw a brand new car. I immediately looked at the license plates, and I saw that there was a piece of paper covering the numbers. I thought, this isn't right. I need to call the police. And the rest is history.
NTV then play a very 90s musical sting to punctuate this moment. They do it all through the show, at all the dramatic moments. A little cue for the viewers at home, just in case they're missing the significance of what's happening. Because this isn't just television. This is history in the making. Nikolai then asks the other residents what they think. Did it feel like a drill to them? A man in a red shirt raises his hand. No, it didn't seem like a drill to us, he says. When they evacuated us, he tells Nikolai, the police were running around, calling, knocking, telling everyone the building was mined. Another man says his 3-year-old still isn't sleeping. And then a woman describes the sheer panic of that night.
У нас 3-летний ребенок, моего.
She says she pulled her child out of the bath, wrapped him in rags and ran like mad. Nikolai asks her if it felt like a drill. Nikolai then has a suggestion for the residents. Says they can ask the FSB officers in the studio directly about the drill. A man takes the mic, turns to the FSB. He stares them down and says,
Я хочу задать вопрос, вообще-то, кто имел право?
Who gave you the right to conduct these exercises on ordinary people? Who gave you the right to conduct them at all? Was it the president or someone else? The camera cuts to a shot of the FSB men. They're whispering to each other, looking flustered. These were training exercises, they say. They posed no danger. There were no explosives, no detonators. And they repeat, no one was ever in danger. They pointedly ignore the reference to the president. This carries on for the next few minutes, residents asking the FSB why they were deceived. describing how people ended up in hospital, traumatized. Then another man who's sitting with all the residents starts speaking. Says he believes the FSB, thinks it was just a drill. It's a big moment. He's the only person to say this. The other residents look confused. Then they look at him more closely. Wait, they say, we've never seen this guy before.
Why are you giving him the floor? He is not a resident of our building. He is a complete outsider. You're not a resident of our building.
The back and forth continues, and the FSB officers look increasingly tense. One FSB officer insists the drill was legal, says it was all part of a bigger operation, grandly called Whirlwind Anti-Terror, which was carried out across Russia to make sure people were safe. In other words, Ryazan wasn't the only drill, there were others too. The residents look unconvinced, but then, just when it seems the FSB has run out of answers, they hint at a trump card. Proof, they say, that they can be trusted.
Кстати говоря, я хотел сказать, мы специально принесли вот все вещественные доказательства по делу.
Looking smug, an FSB man holds up a flimsy brown paper bag. It looks like a takeout bag that's been taped together in the shape of a suitcase. This, he says, contains proof that everything we've said is true. There's just one problem, he says. He's not allowed to show anyone what's inside. The residents will just have to believe him. Again, the residents look unimpressed. It's all feeling, well, pretty desperate. Did the FSB really think anyone would be convinced by a brown paper bag and a vague promise that it held the key evidence? And by now, it's clear. This is not how the FSB pictured their big TV moment playing out. And it doesn't stop the questions. A man in the audience says he's former military. He says he's worked on drills like this before, and that none of what he's heard from the FSB makes sense. No one will believe you, he says. You started this, and then it all snowballed, and now you can't backtrack. The FSB are losing the room, and perhaps the audience at home, by the minute. Whoever had thought this was a good idea must, by now, be watching from behind their sofa. Towards the end, there's a surreal discussion about the white powder that was in the sacks in the basement, the sacks that were attached to the detonator. The FSB say the powder was sugar.
Я эти видел мешки буквально в 3 метрах, когда они лежали. Они напоминали, я не знаю, может, они не их.
But Alexei Kartofalnikov, the man who called the police, says, no, it didn't look like sugar. It was yellow. Kind of like vermicelli cut into granules. The FSB push back. What does he know about sugar, they ask. Sugar can look very different depending on where it's from. Has he seen Cuban sugar, they ask? That can be yellow. And so the TV show that begins with questions about a bomb that forced people out of their homes in the middle of the night, terrified they were about to die in their beds, just as hundreds had done in the weeks before, now ends with an intricate discussion about different strains of sugar from different parts of the world. You can see the frustration building in the studio. And eventually, a man in glasses takes the microphone.
I want to say this. We are falling for a very clever trick. In September of last year, a monstrous and immoral experiment was conducted on 200 citizens of Ryazan. And now we are starting to get lost in a web of absurd, meaningless, so-called expert conclusions.
And that's it. The show's over. As the credits roll, the residents of Ryazan stand up, start whispering in corners. Meanwhile, the FSB, they look worried, shell-shocked. It's hard to say what they thought would happen by going on this show. Did they think it would be good PR? But everything that's just happened, it's clearly not what the FSB wanted. And the timing, it's critical. In just 3 days, Russians will vote for a new president. Yet here's a primetime TV show raising dangerous questions about the apartment bombs. Were they really the work of Chechen militants? Or was the FSB involved? And then, the question no one on the show dares ask explicitly, if the FSB was involved, what about presidential candidate Vladimir Putin, who was head of the FSB until he became prime minister, less than 4 weeks before the first bomb exploded? What was the general reaction to the TV show? Did many people watch it? Was there a big reaction in the press?
Listen, there were only 4 major television channels in Russia. We were one of the 4 leading television channels, and any program going on the air prime time was inevitably a very top-rated program.
Put simply, the ratings were huge. And the FSB?
They were not happy about their own participation. It was written on their foreheads.
Soon after, there was a phone call to NTV from a government minister.
He warned us that this program will never be forgotten. They will never forgive you for this.
How did you feel after that phone call? Were you worried for the future?
Of course, we were already worried for the future because there were many other signs that we are considered to be disloyal, almost an enemy of the state that is trying to prevent Vladimir Putin from winning the election.
3 days after the NTV show airs, on the 26th of March 2000, Russians go to the polls to vote for their new president.
For many, Vladimir Putin seems already to be incumbent, since Boris Yeltsin made him acting president on New Year's Eve.
At NTV's studio in Moscow, it's a busy day for Yevgeny and his team.
We had lots of well-known political figures in our studio. We had feeds from all across Russia, from big cities.
It's been a strange election to cover. Putin's avoided all the TV debates, while state TV has covered his every move. His speeches for soldiers fighting in Chechnya, and his rides in fighter jets flying over the Chechen capital of Grozny. Campaign ads? Putin's not needed those. State TV has done the work for him, attacking his rivals, which meant serious competitors stayed out of the race.
Because they understood that it's almost impossible to compete with Putin under the circumstances.
In the end, only a few candidates stand against Putin. And by the evening of the 26th of March,
it looks as if Russia's going to have a lean, fit and sober president for the first time in several years. Vladimir Putin, Boris Yeltsin's chosen heir apparent, looks set to be elected to the job this Sunday.
This morning's headlines. Vladimir Putin is on course for an outright win in the first ballot in Russia's presidential election.
From Britain, Tony Blair rang Mr. Putin to congratulate him and to ask him what he planned to do.
Vladimir Putin is elected president of Russia.
In that election, you have to wonder if anyone who voted for Putin could have imagined he'd still be in power over 25 years later. It's May the 7th, 2000, just 2 months after Putin's landslide victory. He's walking into the Kremlin's Grand Palace for his inauguration. He's a solitary figure, dwarfed by the vast halls with their ornate frescoes and glittering chandeliers.
Клянусь, при осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации.
Putin recites the presidential oath, promises to protect Russia and faithfully serve the people. Everyone is watching, inside and outside the country, to see what kind of Russia Putin wants, what they can expect from this little-known KGB man.
Безопасность и целостность и охранять.
4 days later, in downtown Moscow, they find out. a group of men have just broken into the headquarters of the owners of NTV.
Heavily armed group of FSB commandos in military fatigues, black balaclavas with semi-automatic assault rifles, and that was something Moscow never saw before.
The FSB commandos rifle through drawers, then arrest the founder of the NTV network. Later, the authorities say they did this because they were looking for tax irregularities. But the message to NTV seems clear. Stop going after Putin. Did it have an effect on your reporting?
I'm proud to say that it did not seriously change our way of reporting. We were trying to do what we are supposed to do, and to hell with everything that may follow. Was I going to abandon my style of presenting the news? No. I did my best not to feel and show that I'm really scared, that I understand these people may even resort to worse things, including killing me. But I had that feeling that nevertheless I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. I'm not going to think of any consequences.
And for a while, Yevgeny and NTV fight back, keep going with their Putin puppet shows, keep asking tough questions about the apartment bombs. But it doesn't last. The owner of NTV is thrown in prison. When he's released, he flees Russia, never to return. NTV is then taken over by a state-owned company. They destroy the Putin puppet and cut the Kukly show. Political satire under Putin, it seems, is over. Yevgeny had hoped that as Putin cracked down on Russian journalists, there might be pushback from the West. But the pushback never comes. Russian journalists are on their own.
We miscalculated. We thought that we'll be capable of stirring up public protest in Russia, drawing the attention of international public opinion, and foreign politicians would help us. But unfortunately, very many people looked at us as if we are conspiracy theorists. And foreign politicians were very happy about the emergence of a young, new and energetic leader, Mr. Putin.
And one by one, Western leaders line up to make friends with him. What began with Blair and Clinton has now turned into a full-blown Western love-in with Putin. In June 2001, a year after Putin becomes president, he meets the new American President George W. Bush for the first time. Afterwards, at their joint press conference, a journalist asks Bush a simple but loaded question. Can Putin be trusted?
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
A few months later, in September 2001, after the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, Putin is the first leader to call the White House. Next, he commits to forging a new relationship with NATO allies. Putin's growing ever closer to the West, turning up at summits and conferences, and European leaders are eager to meet him and talk about Russia's abundant supply of cheap oil and gas. And for a while, the West ignores the whispers about the FSB's possible involvement in Russia's apartment bombs and about its new president. But the West can't ignore these rumours forever, because very soon, 2 Russians will arrive in London, bringing dark tales of Putin and the apartment bombs with them. In London, these men hope to find safety. But not before long, both men will be dead. Next time on Putin and the apartment bombs.
I'll be honest, initially it seemed too fanciful, this idea that someone could have been poisoned in London. And there were no answers.
At that point, you find out his name.
So you realise he's someone who's written a book claiming that the Russian security services had been involved in the 1999 apartment bombings.
The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown. As a journalist, of all the things you're asked to cover, few are as dull as the press conference. Hot, airless rooms, complicated systems about who asks questions, and the revelatory story you're often promised, rarely revelatory. But every so often, you get lucky. So you're sitting there, just set the scene then, set the scene of the room, like how many journalists and what did it look like and who was on the stage?
I was quite surprised at how many people were there. I'm in this room, there's 100 journalists. I don't recognise a lot of them. Normally, you turn up, no one else is there, because a lot of people are holding press conferences all the time. He was like a leader in waiting or something. I just remember thinking, there's a lot of people backing this guy.
We're picking up our story on the 5th of March, 2002. 3 years since the apartment bombs that killed some 300 people. 2 since Vladimir Putin became president. And apart from a few journalists and politicians in Russia still investigating the attacks, the world's mostly moved on. But today, thousands of miles from Moscow in London, there's a press conference about the bombs. And journalists at the BBC's Newsnight programme, one of Britain's most prominent TV news shows, have sent their presenter to cover it. BBC journalist Jeremy Vine.
It was just, can you go and attend this press conference? And, is your microphone working? So I went with a working microphone and a camera operator.
Jeremy's now a seasoned broadcaster with his own BBC radio show. But back then, he was just starting out.
I was amazed looking back at this tape because I'm such a square and I look so posh and I've got this side parting and I've got no grey hair. And at the time, I was on Newsnight. I was a really keen bunny.
And at this press conference, journalists have been told to expect something big, a fresh twist about the apartment bombs. And when you got there, did you know what he was going to say?
So we were there for some red meat. We were thinking we were going to learn something quite important. Someone had definitely said, this guy is telling maybe not the truth, but a truth that you need to hear.
The man on stage, leading this press conference, has been preparing the ground for weeks. He's told the New York Times that he has important evidence about who'd bombed the apartments. Proof, he said, that is no less than the evidence the United States had that Osama bin Laden was responsible for the World Trade Center attacks. The question now, would anyone believe him? I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 4, The Poisoning. The man holding this press conference, we've not met him in our story so far, but he's always been there, in the shadows. His name? Boris Berezovsky. Boris Berezovsky was one of the first Russian oligarchs, this group of business tycoons who became rich overnight in the 90s. He was charismatic, confident.
He had that swagger of the self-made man.
Like all the oligarchs, Berezovsky was ambitious and astonishingly wealthy. But he had something that gave him the edge. He became the main shareholder in Channel 1, Russia's most-watched TV channel, which became Berezovsky's personal propaganda machine. So Berezovsky didn't just have money, he had influence. As a Russian journalist put it, to Berezovsky, Russia was a chessboard. but one on which only he moved the pieces. And in 1999, Berezovsky made his biggest move yet. He used his money and power to help propel Vladimir Putin to the presidency. Berezovsky now saw himself as the Russian kingmaker. But his new king was about to turn against him. Shortly after Putin became president, Putin went after Berezovsky, wrestling Channel 1 out of his hands. And Berezovsky, he was furious.
Boris Berezovsky had backed Mr. Putin during his election campaign, but he's now expected to become one of the president's fiercest critics.
He declared war on Vladimir Putin.
He helped to make Vladimir Putin, but now he says he's gone too far.
Why am I taking this step? I don't want to take part in the destruction of Russia. That's what's going on. I'm convinced of that.
The two men, once friends, were now enemies, locked into a bitter feud. Soon there was an arrest warrant for Berezovsky on charges of fraud. It was clear. This was a fight Berezovsky couldn't win, and he fled Russia for London. The Russian kingmaker, now in exile.
It's all a long way from the Yeltsin era, when Berezovsky was a Kremlin insider and a kingmaker for Vladimir Putin. Now his creature has outgrown him.
And now, 2 years later, in March 2002, still burning with rage, Boris Berezovsky has called this press conference in London, where he's about to share what he says will be a shocking revelation. Berezovsky begins the press conference by playing a film about the apartment bombs. It explores all the unresolved questions, like that unexploded bomb in Ryazan that the FSB says was a training exercise. Then it's time for Berezovsky's announcement. Watching in the audience, the BBC's Jeremy Vine.
The accusation he made was that the FSB had carried out the apartment bombings in order to give Putin credit for tackling Chechnya, which would then lead him to the presidency.
This wasn't a new theory. Russian journalists and opposition figures had said it for years. But now it's Boris Berezovsky saying it, the former Kremlin kingmaker, the man who'd helped install Putin in the first place. And here he is saying that the apartment bombs were an inside job. When you heard that idea, what was your immediate reaction?
I remember thinking, this looks like a guy with an agenda. He's a rich bloke. He's fallen out with Putin. He wants to give him, in football you'd call it an X-rated sliding tackle, sort of give him some shin pain. And it seemed to me like this was essentially him taking a little bit of vengeance or a sideswipe at Putin.
And so, when it's time for questions, Jeremy Vine puts this to Berezovsky.
Do you concede that you will be seen to have a political motive here, which is, in saying all this, to unseat the man who shut down your TV station?
And Boris Berezovsky replies,
anyone is able to think about my motivation, everything he wants, you understand? You see, I don't want to discuss about this point. I just present evidence, which, from my point of view, are very important for Russia.
It's a defensive reply from a man who hates Putin. And so this bombshell announcement about the bombs? Well, none of the journalists in the room seem to believe it.
The chances of this press conference being seen on TV in Russia, where Mr. Berezovsky is now a wanted man, are, one presumes, remote or slight. The evidence that we've just heard in this room was sketchy. The story disturbing. The man at the centre of it, an enigma.
That night,
we're joined now by Mr. Berezovsky in the studio to talk a bit more about these allegations.
Newsnight brings Boris Berezovsky into the BBC studio for a live interview.
All your evidence seems to point to a bomb that didn't explode, but you don't have evidence on the incidents where the bombs tragically did.
No, I have, because the same mechanism was used in Moscow, absolutely the same. The same explosive, hexagen, the same detonator, the same technology. But in Moscow, the houses were exploded. In Ryazan, it was stopped by a person who suddenly watched what happened there.
Now, but while these bombs were going off, where were you? You were actually at Mr. Putin's side. You were his ally. You were his friend.
Absolutely correct. I supported Putin during his election campaign. And after 1 year, I cut my relations with Putin.
You cut your relations because you fell out over your TV station.
Absolutely correct. But my motivation here is very simple. The people of Russia had the biggest terroristic attack for the history of Russia. And no one today from official explained what happened. Just one version, that it was done by Chechens. This version does not work. My understanding is that it was organized by FSB people, and I presented
that's FSB,
facts.
and that's the Internal Secret Services of Russia.
Correct.
Okay, so in a short answer, do you believe Mr. Putin knew or authorized these attacks, in your opinion?
At least knew.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Berezovsky.
And that's it. Boris Berezovsky leaves the studio. And the story? It sinks. This was the most high-profile accusation yet that the 1999 apartment bombs were somehow linked to the Russian state. Berezovsky hoped his intervention would spark new investigations, maybe even real consequences. Instead, it did the opposite. It discredited the theory. Overnight, the inside job idea became tied to Berezovsky, and anything Berezovsky said about Putin looked like score settling. Hard to take seriously. And this, perhaps, is where the tale of the apartment bombs might have ended. But there was something, or rather someone, at that press conference that Jeremy Vine didn't notice. Were you aware of a man called Alexander Litvinenko in the room?
No, I wasn't. Was he in the audience?
Yes.
Okay. That's amazing. God, that's incredible. So I mean, obviously in hindsight, you just think, wow, if you could see what was going to happen.
Alexander Litvinenko, a name most people in Britain know, because a few years after that press conference, he'll be poisoned on the streets of London, dying slowly in the glare of the media spotlight. But what most people don't know, even now, was that Litvinenko had spent the last years of his life investigating one particular story. This one, the apartment bombs. So why don't we actually go back to 2006?
Mm-hmm. So the timeline, I was kind of going back as much as I could over it, although it's hard.
This is journalist Gordon Carrera. He used to work at the BBC, covering national security. And in 2006, 4 years after Berezovsky's press conference, Gordon was about to land in the middle of a story that would change how the West thought about the Russian state and what it was capable of. It all begins on a cold autumn day in November 2006.
I remember a colleague of mine coming up to me and saying that some of his contacts had told him about this really odd story that a former Russian spy or security officer was ill and was claiming he'd been poisoned. And he said to me, you might want to look into this.
So Gordon makes a few calls.
But I'll be honest, initially, it just seemed too fanciful, this idea that someone could have been poisoned in London. And, the news desk was asking, everyone was kind of asking, well, what do we know? And there were no answers.
No answers because it just sounded too implausible. It's the kind of thing that happened in the dark days of the Cold War, with KGB assassins wielding poisoned umbrellas, not in the 21st century. And at that point you find out his name, Alexander Litvinenko. Back then, not a familiar name. So Gordon starts digging. Discovers Litvinenko had been in the FSB since the 90s, part of a special unit investigating crime in Russia. And one of his first jobs was to monitor Boris Berezovsky.
And also to report back on him.
At least, that's how it starts. But a few years later, Litvinenko's orders change.
Litvinenko is asked by superior to kill Boris Berezovsky.
Why?
There were factions who hated Berezovsky. He was a schemer and a manipulator himself, and had become very rich, and so he certainly had lots of enemies.
So what does he do? He's asked to kill him?
So Litvinenko actually decides, partly because he's got to know Berezovsky over the years, that instead he's going to tell him.
But that's not all. Litvinenko wants to go further, wants to tell people higher up the FSB chain about the corruption he's seen. So he goes to see the man who's just become the new director of the FSB.
And the new man is Vladimir Putin. And Litvinenko goes to see Putin with this dossier of evidence. And he's saying to Putin, look, here are the corrupt people. You can clear house. You can do something about it. And when Litvinenko offers him the dossier, Putin says, no, you keep it. I don't want it. And I think at that point, Litvinenko must realise that Putin may not be the man to clear house.
The meeting lasts 10 minutes. Litvinenko leaves with a target on his back.
And so Litvinenko, he realises his time is up.
You'd think at this point that Litvinenko might disappear into the shadows. But he does the opposite. He comes out into the light.
He goes public, extraordinarily reckless, really.
In November 1998, Alexander Litvinenko and 4 other FSB officers organise a press conference. In the footage, you see Litvinenko in a brown suit and shirt, reading from a statement describing the corruption within the FSB.
And what's even more amazing is other FSB officers are in masks because they know the risks.
Hiding their face.
Hiding their face because they know the risks for them. He is there, no mask to be seen. He's made the choice to be the public face, alleging deep corruption within the Russian security services.
And that choice changes Litvinenko's life.
He's put in prison. 8 months he's in prison in Moscow, including when the bombings happen.
Then, after he's released,
he is charged again.
And each time the charges change.
Because they're just looking for something to get him on. He's also getting death threats. So he knows his life is in danger. And so he realises he's got to get out.
It takes months of secret planning. But eventually, in November 2000, a year after the apartment bombs, Alexander Litvinenko and his family make it to Heathrow Airport in Britain.
And he finds the first police officer he can see and just walks up to them and says, I am a KGB officer and I want asylum. And that is the start of his time in the UK.
So now Litvinenko has to make a new life for himself. And for that, he needs money. And that's where his old friend comes in.
He's supported by Boris Berezovsky. So Berezovsky funds him and helps with a house, helps with a regular supply of money.
And what does he get in return?
Berezovsky is basically plotting against Putin and collecting around him Putin critics. Whether it's Chechen leaders in exile, intellectuals, or former Russian security officers like Alexander Litvinenko. Berezovsky is collecting them, funding them, using them to support his campaign to undermine Putin.
And one of the things Berezovsky funds is an investigation into the apartment bombs. And the man who carries it out? Alexander Litvinenko. Now, Litvinenko was no longer in the FSB at the time of the apartment bombs. As you just heard, he was in prison at the time of the attacks. So he's starting this investigation from scratch, along with Russian historian Yuri Felttinsky.
They interview people, they go around and try and find other people who've been in the FSB and who might be in exile in various parts of Europe, who might be able to provide information.
Litvinenko and Felttinsky spread their net wide. They interview victims whose relatives died in the bombings. They track down one of the government's main suspects hiding in Georgia, who they believe was set up. They comb through newspapers and government reports. And it's there that Litvinenko stumbles across something odd. He finds a transcript of a session from the Duma, the Russian parliament. It's from the morning of September the 13th, 1999, the time of the apartment bombs. And I'm going to read you some of this transcript because of all the things that have come to light since the apartment bombs, this is possibly the wildest of them all. The Speaker of the Russian Parliament takes to the floor and says, "Esteemed colleagues, today in Russia is a day of mourning. Let us start our meeting and stand in memory of all the people killed in Dagestan and Moscow." He's referring to the first 2 apartment bombs. There's a minute's silence, And then the speaker is handed a note. There's a pause as he gathers himself, taking in its contents, and then he reads it aloud to everyone there. It is reported, he says, that tonight an apartment was bombed in the town of Volgodonsk. It's the third apartment bomb. But here's the thing. The apartment bombed that night wasn't in Volgodonsk. It was in Moscow. An innocent mistake, perhaps, so no one says anything at the time. But then, 3 days later...
Volgodonsk in southern Russia hasn't experienced anything like it since the Second World War.
The fourth apartment is blown up. Where? In Volgodonsk.
A massive explosion that ripped the face from this 9-story block of flats as its occupants lay asleep in their beds. Someone, somewhere in Russia is doing this, but no one knows who or why.
Now, mistaking the name of a city where a bomb explodes is one thing. But for that city to be the very place where an apartment is bombed 3 days later in the largest country in the world, well, could that really just be a coincidence? And a few days later, someone spots this. A member of parliament takes to the floor to ask a question about it. But soon after he begins speaking, his microphone is cut off. Litvinenko makes a copy of the transcript and writes up all the details of his investigation, along with Yuri Felchtinsky. And in the summer of 2001, their book is published. It's called The FSB Blows Up Russia, and that, in a nutshell, is their conclusion. That the FSB bombed those Russian apartments. After the book comes out, a Russian newspaper prints a few chapters, but that's about it. There's very little coverage of the book by any Western journalists. In London, Boris Berezovsky promotes it, but that backfires.
One of the problems was that Berezovsky was known to be such a kind of schemer that it didn't necessarily add to the credibility the fact that he had backed the book and was promoting it. I think if it had been written more independently, it might have had more weight and more impact. But I think it was seen at the time as part of the battle between these two big figures, Berezovsky and Putin. And the book was a kind of tool that Berezovsky was using, or a weapon, against Putin. I think that may have led people not to take it as seriously as they might have done, or as they might do now.
But there's one place that does take an interest in the book. The FSB. This organisation that Litvinenko was part of, that now he's trying to bring down. And there, Litvinenko is so hated that when special forces are doing target practice, to give them extra motivation, they shoot at photos of Litvinenko's face.
Within the FSB, he was marked as a traitor and hated.
So, just like Berezovsky's press conference, Litvinenko's book sinks from view, and his story, it goes quiet. Until, that is, November 2006, when Gordon Correra hears a rumour that Alexander Litvinenko has been poisoned.
Well, I'm trying to work out whether it's potentially true that he was poisoned. And the problem is no one knows. So I'm talking to police, to MI5, and they're
what are they saying?
They don't know either.
What they do know is that Alexander Litvinenko is very ill, lying in a bed at University College Hospital in London.
I remember going down there. There's lots of journalists, lots of people asking questions.
At first, doctors think it's just food poisoning or a tummy bug. But every day, Litvinenko gets sicker, and the crowds outside the hospital grow. No one knows whether to believe the rumours that he's been poisoned until the 19th of November, 2 weeks after he went into hospital.
Good evening. Scotland Yard is investigating the poisoning of a Russian dissident living in Britain.
Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian spy, became ill earlier this month, shortly after meeting a contact in London.
His doctors say he was given a potentially lethal dose of the chemical thallium.
Now, finally, his doctors confirm he's been poisoned. The next day, a photograph is released. It shows Alexander Litvinenko sitting in a hospital bed. His hair's fallen out, He's now completely bald, a tangle of wires covering his chest. He's looking directly into the camera, a resigned look in his eyes, of a man who knows he's about to die.
What do you remember thinking when you saw it?
I remember wondering what could do that to a man. Because you could see a picture of him with his hair looking young and healthy. And then you saw this person, whose hair was gone. And you're like, this is not a normal poisoning. This is not something normal.
And now there's a race against time to identify the poison, in the hope they can still save him. All doctors know is that the poison contained some kind of radiation.
Because the radiation is cooking him from the inside, it's cooking his organs and destroying his organs progressively. His body was collapsing. And poor Marina, who when she first goes to him...
His
wife, she tries to stroke his hair because he's so ill, and his hair just comes out in her hand. And, having to watch that deterioration, knowing basically there's no hope for him. Because I think there was never any hope for him once they realised what it was.
And doctors only find out what was making him sick on the 23rd of November, 22 days after Litvinenko became ill. They'd sent a urine sample to Britain's top-secret nuclear research site in the UK. And the results were astonishing.
The tests come back and say, yes, it's this incredibly rare substance, polonium. And the fact it's polonium is crucial because, this is not something you can buy. You can't buy this off the internet. You can't find it. You can't make it yourself. You get it from a nuclear program, which only a state has.
But by the time they identify the poison, it's too late.
Now, within the past minute or two, we've just had it confirmed that the poisoned Russian ex-spy Alexander Litvinenko has died in hospital in London. I understand...
We're sorry to announce that Alexander Litvinenko died at University College Hospital at 9:21 on the 23rd of November 2006. He was seriously ill.
I remember realising that this was something completely different from anything we'd covered before or thought that was possible. I mean, the death of Alexander Litvinenko and who was behind it and its consequences, actually it would become one of the stories that stayed with me more than almost any other.
Before he died, Alexander Litvinenko summoned the strength for a final act of resistance.
From his deathbed, he dictated a message. This morning, it was read outside the hospital, and it was aimed directly at President Putin.
Shall I read it?
Yes, please.
So this is the statement in the name of Alexander Litvinenko, but read by his friend Alex Goldfarb just after he died, standing with a kind of group of journalists, lots of cameras, lots of people just outside University College Hospital. You may succeed in silencing me, but that silence comes at a price. You have shown yourself to be as barbaric and ruthless as your most hostile critics have claimed. You have shown yourself to have no respect for life, liberty, or any civilized value. You have shown yourself to be unworthy of your office, to be unworthy of the trust of civilized men and women. You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest
from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life. May God forgive you for what you have done, not only to me, but to beloved Russia and its people.
Years later, the British government will conduct an inquiry into Litvinenko's death. They'll conclude that he was poisoned by agents acting on behalf of the Russian state, that the kill order probably came from Vladimir Putin himself, a claim the Kremlin denies.
Do you think Litvinenko's allegations on the apartment bombings made him a target? How big a role did that play?
I always think with Litvinenko, it's not finding a motive for why the Russian state would have killed him, but choosing from so many. Because frankly, there were so many reasons why I think they wanted him dead. He is a former FSB officer who's in exile. He's someone who had a direct and personal animosity with Vladimir Putin, and who was working with Boris Berezovsky, Putin's kind of arch critic, And I do think the apartment bombings were one of the more significant factors. And, you know, a lot of people who've investigated the apartment bombings have met untimely ends.
At the end of the last episode, we said there were 2 deaths for the 2 men who'd come to London, hoping to find safety. Litvinenko died in 2006. 7 years later,
the Russian businessman Boris Berezovsky is found dead at his home in Berkshire.
Tonight, outside his home in Ascot, a heavy police presence as they launch an investigation into his death.
The body of the 67-year-old was discovered in a bathroom by an employee who had to force open the door.
Boris Berezovsky is found dead on the bathroom floor of his house with a scarf around his neck. At first, Berezovsky's death is described as suicide by hanging. But given his public feud with Putin, many wonder if there's more to it. A year later at the inquest, the coroner says he can't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Berezovsky took his own life or that he was unlawfully killed. And that's where the inquest ends. Boris Berezovsky's death will probably always remain a mystery, much like the finer details of his life. In his obituaries in the Russian media, Berezovsky was described as a cunning master of chaos, an evil genius, a giant spider who tangled so many in his web. And journalists who met him, or who, like Jeremy Vine, went to his press conferences, were right to question his motivations. But people like Boris Berezovsky make the job of us journalists much harder. His feud with Putin was real, and he had a score to settle. So how far can you trust a man with motives as complex as his? How do you know when the truth spinner becomes a truth teller? Especially when delivering a message that feels impossible to believe. So often, the answer only comes with that precious thing that news journalists don't have when they file their copy: hindsight.
Looking back, I wonder whether this might have been a press conference where the guy was genuinely trying to get something off his chest. Gosh, these things you don't realise they're important until maybe 20 years later.
Next time on Putin and the apartment bombs. We're back in Russia, where the investigation Litvinenko began is reignited by another former FSB officer, determined to expose the truth.
I was tipped off that there was one FSB investigator, former KGB, who was still following this story and had a kind of an amazing story in his own right to tell.
And unlike Litvinenko, this FSB officer lives to tell his tale. The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown. It's early morning in Moscow, 2008, just before 5 a.m. It's quiet, not much happening on Kasherska Highway, a street in a working-class neighbourhood on the edge of the city. But that's about to change. In a few minutes, dozens of people will emerge from the shadows, carrying candles and red carnations. Because it was here, on this spot, 9 years ago to the day, on the 13th of September 1999, that an apartment block exploded while people slept in their beds. Over 90 people killed. Newspapers at the time described the scene. How after the explosion, the only trace of the families who'd lived there were children's toys, drifting in pools of mud. This was the third of the 4 apartment bombs that killed some 300 people in just 2 weeks. And every year since, families of those who died come back. They stand here in the half-light to remember. And among them this year is an American journalist.
Let's join the dots to you getting to Moscow in 2008. Perhaps you can introduce that bit of the story for us.
Well, I had covered the first Chechen war in '95 for the New York Times Magazine.
This is journalist Scott Anderson.
After that story, I became very interested in what was happening in Chechnya and the series of apartment building bombings in which several hundred people had been killed, and it was blamed on the Chechens. And for me, there was something right away that didn't make sense. I think when you look at a story like this, what you always have to first think about is motive. And what motive did the Chechens have to do this?
As Scott sees it, the Chechens had got a peace deal at the end of the First Chechen War. Russian soldiers had left their country. So why would they stir things up again?
It just didn't make any sense to me. And finally, in 2008, watching Vladimir Putin's rise to power, I thought, I want to go back and investigate this story.
And that's how Scott finds himself on this street at dawn, here to find answers. It's now just after 5 a.m. At the site of the former apartment building, Scott can see a couple of police cars. Nothing else.
It had blown up at 5:03 a.m. So I went at that exact time, and then all of a sudden, maybe 24 people, civilians, walked up to this memorial for the bombing victims. They laid some wreaths, they lit some candles, they said some prayers, and then they left, being watched over by the police the whole time. And there was one elderly man who was kind of apart from them, very upset, very emotional. He would leave and then he would come back. And he did this maybe 3 or 4 times.
Eventually, Scott decides to follow him.
I wanted to get his personal story. And it turned out that his daughter and grandson and son-in-law had all been killed in the bombing.
Wow.
And he said, they blame this on the Chechens, but that's a lie. Everybody knows the FSB did it.
Scott tries to interview him, but the man gets upset, says he can't talk in front of the police. So Scott asks if they can talk another time.
And he said, yes, I'll talk to you. That's fine. I'll tell you what I know.
But when Scott calls a few days later,
he said, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. It's just too dangerous for me. And he just hung up on me. So I approached several journalists, Russians, who had reported at the time. None of them wanted to talk to me.
It's not surprising. It's 2008, just 2 years since Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in Britain after investigating the apartment bombs. It's still so sensitive.
That's right. Again and again, people would hang up on me or say, I can't talk about it. I saw the way people receded when I started poking around about this story. And all of a sudden I felt very alone.
But then Scott hears about someone who will talk.
Finally, I was tipped off that there was one FSB investigator, former KGB, who was still following this story and had a kind of an amazing story in his own right to tell.
The man Scott ends up talking to wasn't just following the story of the apartment bombs. He was drawn directly into it, tugging at the loose threads until they entangled him. But unlike Alexander Litvinenko, this man is still alive to tell his tale. I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau. Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 5. The Investigator. A few days after the anniversary of the bombs, journalist Scott Anderson is in a cafe. He's managed to track down this former FSB investigator that he was tipped off about. He's called Mikhail Trepashkin. And all Scott knows about him is that he once worked for the Russian Internal Security Service. And he's intrigued, wants to know why this former FSB guy started investigating the apartment bombs. Scott doesn't even know what Mikhail Trepashkin looks like, but then a man walks in. And Scott knows right away, this must be him.
Short, but very powerfully built. He had this kind of unnerving half smile that I thought, I thought if you were being interrogated and this guy walked in your interrogation room, you'd want to start talking. I mean, he just had
the right look.
He had this manner about him.
Then there was the other, more obvious giveaway.
He had 2 bodyguards with him. I don't know if they were armed, but you got a sense that this was a man who was obviously in some personal danger.
They sit and talk, the 2 men trying to get a measure of each other.
And finally, towards the end of our first meeting, he brought out this folder and handed it to me. And inside was his 16-page long resume, his CV. And what was fascinating to me about it was all the stuff he had done over the years for the KGB. And he was clearly very, very proud of his KGB background. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the KGB mutated into the FSB. And Trepashkin had gone on to be in the FSB.
And do you think there was a sense of him wanting to sort of prove his credentials?
Yes, I think he wanted to make it very clear to me that he was important. He wasn't some flunky within the organization, and that he had been involved in a lot of very dicey things.
Now, before we get into Mikhail Trepashkin's story, we want to be clear about something. We've not spoken with Mikhail Trepashkin ourselves. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from Scott Anderson's interviews with him, along with other sources that corroborate parts of his account. So, in this cafe, Trepashkin starts telling Scott his story. For years, Mikhail Trepashkin had been an FSB diehard. But in 1995, Trepashkin says he was assigned a case that would change everything he thought he knew about the FSB. This was 4 years before the apartment bombs and before Putin became president. Trepashkin had been working as an FSB criminal investigator, taking down gangs across Russia. And for this new case, Trepashkin's target was a gang robbing banks across Moscow. One night, Trepashkin says, he and a team of FSB officers stage a sting operation. Waiting at a bank they know the gang's about to hit.
And they actually caught the robbers, the gang, inside a bank.
They storm in and arrest the thieves. But when they search the bank, according to Trepashkin, they find something unexpected. Small microphones hidden all over the building. Someone's been listening in. Trepashkin and his team take the recording equipment back to FSB headquarters. Then they trace them using the serial numbers. And what they find, he says, is a shock. The recording equipment had all come from the FSB and the Ministry of Defense. In other words, Trepashkin believed that the gang robbing banks had been working with people from inside the government.
And what they discovered was that the way this gang had operated was that they had people within the FSB who were giving them eavesdropping equipment, who were letting them know where the police were. So this was a group of bank robbers, but it was also a group of FSB agents.
So what does he do about it?
So he takes it up the chain of command. He says, these guys are dirty. We've got to publicize this. We've got to put them in trial.
And he does all this because back in 1995, Mikhail Trepashkin is still a believer, thinks the FSB is a force for good, a shield against corruption and crime in Russia. And he believes that if only the right people above him know what's happening, they'll do something. But when he takes it to his superiors in the FSB,
he gets taken off the case and he gets reprimanded for it.
According to Trepashkin, the FSB ignores these allegations about its own officers, and instead, they start investigating him.
And at that point, it's quite clear to Trepashkin that the rot of the system, the corruption, goes far up the ladder in the FSB.
But then he makes a decision that will change his life.
He writes a letter to the president, Boris Yeltsin.
Oh, wow. So he thinks Yeltsin is clean and the FSB isn't.
That's right. He thinks if I can get word to the president, then we can start getting this thing cleaned up. And that was a wrong move.
Trepashkin soon realizes that President Yeltsin is tangled in his own web of corruption. The system's rotten from the top down. And by sending his letter, Trepashkin's made himself a target. So he's dismissed from the FSB. But he doesn't go quietly. He brings a lawsuit against them. And soon after, he says, he gets a warning.
That they're coming after him. So he's on notice at this point.
Trepashkin says the FSB tries to kill him. Twice. Once in an ambush on a deserted Moscow highway. Once by a rooftop sniper who misses his shot. Now, we haven't been able to corroborate this, but Trepashkin says that both times someone tips him off, and after the second attempt, he gives up the fight. He retrains as a lawyer, ready for a quieter life. Then...
Southern Russia is in turmoil tonight.
In 1999, the 4 apartments are blown up. This part of the story you know, some 300 people killed. The government blames Chechen militants, but 2 years on, no Chechens have been caught. And that strange, unexploded bomb in Ryazan still haunts people's minds. Then, in February 2002, a group of Russian parliamentarians tried to set up an official inquiry to investigate the bombs. There's a vote, and it fails. There isn't enough support. But some members of Parliament refuse to let it go. If Parliament won't investigate, they will. They set up an independent inquiry instead. A small group of politicians, journalists, lawyers and grieving family members. But there's a problem. They're missing someone. Someone who knows the FSB from the inside. And a name comes up. Mikhail Trepashkin. And the person who suggests him?
The person who first brought Trepashkin into the apartment bombing case was a former FSB, former KGB investigator named Alexander Litvinenko.
Litvinenko. This is, of course, before he's poisoned in Britain, when the man the Kremlin would one day call one of Russia's greatest traitors is living in London, quietly running his own investigation into the apartment bombs. And Alexander Litvinenko knows Trepashkin. In fact, before Litvinenko became a whistleblower, Trepashkin says Litvinenko had been ordered to assault him. But instead, the two men became allies, bound by a shared belief that the FSB was deeply corrupt. And Alexander Litvinenko figures that if anyone can help the independent commission uncover who really blew up those apartments, it's Trepashkin. And Trepashkin, he has every reason to say no. He's had enough trouble already with the FSB. But he can't help himself. Mikhail Trepashkin agrees to join the independent commission. And just a few days after, Trepashkin says the pushback begins.
He's at home with his family. He has 2 little girls. And the police just barge into his apartment. They ransack the place. They supposedly find a file, an investigative file that he's not supposed to have in his house. They find a couple of bullets, supposedly.
And does he consider pulling out of the committee at this point?
No, he doesn't. He really, Trepashkin's kind of a figure out of a novel. No, if anything, it's sort of, it eggs him on. And so he continues.
The raid on Trepashkin's apartment doesn't stop him, and he begins his investigation. The first challenge, getting access to the government's files on the apartment bombs. Because Trepashkin knows the FSB won't just hand them over. So he comes up with a plan. Remember, after he left the FSB, Trepashkin retrained as a lawyer, and that means he can take on clients. So he takes on the daughter of a woman killed in the bombs. And because she's a victim, it gives him an opening, a legal foothold into the files he needs.
So as the lawyer for this woman, he was able to get access to the investigative files.
It's the first win. But when Trepashkin finally reads the files, it's a crushing disappointment. He's expecting forensic reports that might contain clues, but there's nothing there.
And these apartment building bombings, they were all cleared up within days. After the bombing of September 11th here in New York, that the World Trade Center was a crime scene for, 7-8 months. In Moscow, everything was cleared away from these bombings within days.
The Russian authorities had demolished what was left of the burnt-out apartments.
So there was no forensic evidence to find.
It's a big blow for the independent commission. How do you investigate these bombs when there's no forensic evidence to work with? And the man chairing the commission is pretty frank about what that means. It becomes almost impossible to work out who blew up those apartments. In an interview with a Russian newspaper, the chairman spells it out. There are plenty of theories about who blew up the apartments, he says, but he doesn't believe any of them. The Chechens, he can't see a motive. An FSB inside job? He can't imagine an officer carrying out something like this without written orders. And yes, the bombs and the Chechen war that followed undeniably helped pave Putin's path to the presidency. But that isn't proof. So, with no clear lead, the commissioners press on, pulling at every loose thread, following every clue. But as they're about to discover, investigating the apartment bombings can be dangerous. On April 17th, 2003, Sergei Yushchenkov, the vice chair of the Independent Commission, is coming home from work. At 6:49 p.m, he steps out of his chauffeur-driven car and walks towards his apartment. What happens next is murky. Did Yushchenkov hear someone follow him? Were they on foot? Or in a car? We'll never know. What we do know is that the vice chair of the Independent Commission investigating the bombs,
Sergei Yushchenkov, was shot to death in broad daylight in front of his apartment in Moscow.
Yushchenkov's wife finds his dead body lying in the street. And his killer? Never found.
And yet Trepashkin carries on?
Yes, Trepashkin carries on.
By this point, Trepashkin is focused on the men the FSB has blamed for the bombings. 9 suspects, all wanted by Interpol. And he's trying to figure out if the FSB have the right guys. Their main suspect is a man called Archemez Gochiyayev. He's a small-time businessman from a republic in southern Russia, near Chechnya. The FSB say he's the mastermind behind it all, that he'd rented flats in the 2 Moscow apartment buildings that were bombed, and that he'd smuggled in the explosives disguised as sacks of sugar. And they say they have a key piece of evidence that proves Gochiyayev was involved. A sketch, one that was released after the first Moscow bomb. Now, the sketch is supposedly based on the description given to police by a building manager who said he'd seen a man slipping into the basement of the apartment building just before the explosion. The sketch, the FSB say, looks just like Gochiyayev. But when Trepashkin digs into this, he finds something odd. Flicking through newspapers from the days after the first bomb, Trepashkin finds the original police sketch, the one drawn from the building manager's eyewitness account. But this sketch, Trepashkin thinks it looks nothing like Gochiyayev.
Utterly different. Utterly different.
And the way Trepashkin sees it, there's only one explanation.
That sketch gets pulled, another one's put in its place.
So they switch the...
That's right.
Somehow the 2 photos are switched.
And there's something else. Trepashkin thinks he recognises the man in the original sketch. He thinks he's an FSB agent. And not just any FSB agent. Trepashkin thinks he's one of the FSB men involved in the bank robbery, the one we mentioned at the start of this episode. It's such a shocking discovery that Trepashkin wants to make sure he's got it right.
Trepashkin goes to the building superintendent of the destroyed building with that old newspaper with the first photo, first composite sketch. And the superintendent goes, yes, that's the guy. So now Trepashkin knows that the man who was identified by the one eyewitness on the scene of the bombing was the man he also knew and knew as an FSB agent.
And there's more. According to Trepashkin, the building superintendent tells him he was coerced by the FSB into changing his description of the man he saw. Now, we've seen these pictures and can see Trepashkin's point. The original police sketch looks nothing like this man the FSB says was the mastermind. But can we say for sure that it looks just like Trepashkin's old FSB colleague? Well, it's hard to say. These pictures go back to the 90s. They're black and white, pretty low tech. But then there's a final strange twist. When Trepashkin tries to track down this FSB agent, he hears that he left Russia shortly after the bombs. He went to Cyprus, and there he was killed in a hit and run. A random accident? Perhaps. But it doesn't feel that way to Trepashkin. An FSB officer who resembles the original sketch of one of the suspected bombers leaves Moscow right after the apartment bombings, and soon after, he ends up dead. Trepashkin writes down everything he finds, collecting all the evidence, and he shares this with the independent commission. But then, on July the 3rd, 2003, a member of the commission, a journalist called Yuri Chechen, begins feeling unwell. At first he thinks it's just a cold, then his face turns bright red like sunburn, and he starts vomiting. He's rushed to hospital where his internal organs shut down, and his skin starts to peel off. It takes 16 days for Yuri to die. When his girlfriend goes to the morgue, she can't find him at first. Then she realizes the old lady lying in the corner isn't in fact an old lady. It's Yuri. Doctors tell the family that Yuri died from an allergic reaction. And perhaps he did. But reporters at the time suspected he'd been poisoned by a radioactive substance, as Alexander Litvinenko would be 3 years later. If Yuri Chechen was poisoned, we can't know why. We don't know how many enemies he had. All we can say for sure is that he died while investigating the apartment bombs, just like Sergei Yushchenkov, the committee's vice chair, and like Alexander Litvinenko 3 years later.
What effect does that have on the committee and everyone else who's part of it?
After those two deaths, the committee rather falls apart. It kind of dissolves. I think most committee members can see the handwriting on the wall. But Trepashkin continues. He doesn't give up.
Why does he carry on?
He's a reformer. In this perverse way, he's the last Russian idealist. He really thinks that somehow he can redeem this system. To me, it's just unfathomable.
So here's Trepashkin, this ex-FSB investigator, holding what might be a smoking gun, the original sketch of a suspect in the apartment bombs, who he thinks is FSB. But what can Trepashkin do with it? Members of the commission investigating the bombs are dying in murky circumstances. Journalists have moved on to other stories. Then, Mikhail Trepashkin, the relentless investigator, he has an idea. In a few months, a trial will begin for 2 men accused of plotting 3 of the apartment bombs. It's a closed trial. No public, no press. But because Trepashkin is representing the daughter of one of the victims, he'll be allowed in. And that's when he plans to make his move, to reveal the original police sketch, to argue that it was swapped, and that the man in the original drawing appears to be FSB. At least, that was his plan. The FSB has always denied allegations of corruption made by Trepashkin and other former FSB officers. In the past, they've said, "We've never been in anybody's pocket, and we never will be." And the FSB has always denied any involvement in the apartment bombs. Vladimir Putin himself, who led the FSB until shortly before the bombs, has said, "No one in the Russian special services would be capable of such a crime against his own people." Next time on Putin and the apartment bombs.
I want to go to the trial and I want to present this evidence there. If anything happens to me, you'll know why.
It was on my first break from Russia, and I flew back immediately and saw this horrific scene.
These pictures were apparently taken by the Chechens themselves, filming what the Russians call one of the most audacious terrorist acts.
They seized the building and held hostages for 3 days.
The car park outside the theatre became a makeshift hospital and mortuary.
Putin came out and apologized. Like, Putin never apologizes for anything. But he said we couldn't save everyone. I'm sorry.
The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown. One of the things that struck me working on this story is the sheer tenacity of some of the people involved. The tenacity it takes to keep digging for answers that have long been buried, or perhaps hidden. There's a kind of recklessness to it. Take Mikhail Trepashkin, the FSB investigator turned whistleblower we talked about in the last episode. 2 of his colleagues investigating the apartment bombs end up dead. One shot outside his house, the other dying in mysterious circumstances. But what does Trepashkin do? He keeps digging.
He's this sort of a remarkable figure in that one after another, people around him are getting killed, and yet he keeps going.
And for Scott Anderson, the American journalist who interviewed him, the precariousness of Trepashkin's world only became clear once he stepped inside it.
In fact, it's kind of funny. I had a number of meetings with Trepashkin. One of the last ones was at his apartment. And as I discovered when I got there, he very rarely would meet outsiders in his apartment. He said, I'm only doing this because my wife is out running errands. And if she knew I was meeting with the foreign journalist, she'd be furious. And the funny thing was that his wife actually came back early while I was still there. And she kicked us out of the house.
Not surprised.
Yeah. So we had finished our interview in the park.
Mikhail Trepashkin's wife had good reason to be scared. She'd seen what happened to him at the time of the apartment bombing trial, how his big plan to derail it had all gone horribly wrong. From the BBC, I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 6, The Trial. It's October 2003, 4 years after the 4 Russian apartment buildings exploded in the night, killing some 300 people. And the government's finally about to start a trial to prosecute 2 of the men they say carried out the attacks. But some people think they had the wrong guys, like Mikhail Trepashkin, who's convinced something doesn't add up. Remember, Trepashkin's been working on the independent commission investigating the apartment bombs. And he thinks he's found a damning piece of evidence that could disrupt the trial. It's a drawing of one of the suspected bombers. According to the FSB, it shows the mastermind behind the attacks. But Trepashkin stumbled across something odd. This FSB sketch isn't the same as the original police drawing of the suspected bomber, the one printed in a newspaper back in 1999. That original sketch looks like someone else. In fact, Trepashkin thinks it looks like an FSB agent, someone that he recognizes from his days inside the FSB. He thinks the picture's been swapped. And now Trepashkin's planning to present this evidence at the government's trial to argue that there's been an FSB cover-up. But first, he has someone to meet. A few days before the trial starts, he gathers his evidence, sketches and newspaper clippings, and he heads to the editorial office of Moscow News.
He meets with a Russian journalist and he shares his information of his suspicions of the case and says, I want to go to the trial and I want to present this evidence there. If anything happens to me, you'll know why.
Was this backup? Do you think he had a sense that something might happen?
Yes. Frankly, he would have been a fool not to. He'd already been arrested once. They had these charges hanging over him. And he was stepping on the third rail of Vladimir Putin's rise to power.
By asking hard questions about the bombs, Trepashkin was digging into Vladimir Putin's origin story. Remember, after the attacks on the apartments, Putin went from a political nobody, a grey mouse as many Russians called him, to president in just a few months. And 4 years on, as the trial approached, there was no longer any trace of that grey mouse. Putin was firmly in control.
At the time, Putin was surprisingly popular. He had surprised people by how vigorous he was a leader.
This is Stephen Lee Myers. He was the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times at the time of the trial.
Putin had largely reconquered Chechnya and brought it back under Russian control, and voters loved that. And that made him a very popular leader. The economy and oil prices were helping Russia at the time. And so you started to see some of the economic growth come back after the financial crisis in the 90s. So I think Putin was, I would say, riding high.
And at this point, there was huge interest all over the world in understanding more about Putin. And so in autumn 2003, early in his posting to Moscow, Stephen Lee Myers thought he should meet him.
As a new bureau chief, I had thought, well, you should interview the head of the country.
And Putin agreed to a sit-down interview with Stephen and his executive editor. But first, the Kremlin asked for a primer on Stephen's newspaper, the New York Times.
So I just kind of made up a memo, kind of Wikipedia version of, the history of the Sulzberger family buying it. It was founded in 1851. Said all the nice things I think about the New York Times. And when the interview began, he addressed the executive editor and talked about how the New York Times is run as this public institution and it's such a great thing. I mean, he was literally just reading off the memo that I had written.
So he'd done his homework.
He had done his homework, but I hadn't told the executive editor this. So he came away thinking, my gosh, look how prepared, Putin really knows his stuff. And, the fact is he does. And that can be charming to people. I think it can also be intimidating. There's the famous story of when he brought his dog in to meet Angela Merkel, knowing that she was afraid of dogs. And so, it can cut both ways.
Putin the charmer, Putin the intimidator, always in control. But during Stephen's first interview with him, there were moments where Putin's mask began to slip. Certain subjects seemed to rattle him.
He would always get very testy about questions about Chechnya, particularly. I also asked him, because I was dying to, about his KGB career, and was there anything that he regretted about it? Because there are still rumors about what exactly he did when he was a KGB officer.
And what did he say?
He has this stock answer. He reminds people that George H.W. Bush was the head of the CIA before he became president. So, he's still kind of defensive about it in a weird way.
What should we make of Putin's defensiveness? Was it just irritation at what he saw as Western hypocrisy? Or the frustration of a man who wanted to move on, to stop answering uncomfortable questions? Questions about the war in Chechnya and about his past in the KGB. Because at this point, in 2003, the world is still trying to work him out, wondering who Vladimir Putin really is and where he's taking Russia. So you arrived almost 3 years after the apartment bombings. Were they still a big story at that point?
Absolutely. There were opposition parties who were asking hard questions about this. There were people who were trying to find out what happened. But given everything that was happening, it wasn't the top story. So we were all busy doing other things as well. You know, when I first arrived in the aftermath of these bombings, the debate could still rage on, but the war hung over everything.
He's referring to the second war with Chechnya that began at the time of the apartment bombs.
The country was at war with itself, with the Chechens in the south, and there were enormous losses on both sides.
From the perspective of a reporter who'd arrived on the scene in those years, the idea that Chechen militants had bombed those 4 apartments wasn't far-fetched. If anything, the violence of Chechen militants was growing ever more apparent.
There was an increasing radicalization of the Chechen movement, and there were terrorist attacks that grew out of that.
There was one particularly horrific attack that Stephen covered shortly after he arrived in Russia. It happened a year before the apartment bombing trial, and it's worth going back to it because it changed how many Russians saw the Chechens and what they were capable of.
It was on my first break from Russia. I was in France, and I flew back immediately and saw this horrific scene.
It all began on October the 23rd, 2002. Almost 1,000 people were sitting in a theatre 5 miles from the Kremlin in Moscow, watching a musical. The second act had just begun, actors tap dancing and singing, when a masked man in camouflage walked out onto the stage.
An entertaining night out at a Moscow theatre. Then, the moment comedy turned to tragedy. A Chechen gunman bursts onto the stage, shouting at the actors to get off.
At first, the audience thought it was all just part of the show. But then it dawned on them. They'd been taken hostage.
These pictures were apparently taken by the Chechens themselves, filming what the Russians call one of the most audacious terrorist acts the world has known.
The videos show women in black hijabs sitting amongst the audience, bombs strapped to their chests. Meanwhile, Chechen gunmen walk along the aisles, sealing the exits. The demand was simple. Russian troops must leave Chechnya, or they'd kill everyone in the theatre.
They seized the building and held hostages for 3 days.
Eventually, the militants released some of the hostages, mostly children, but hundreds were still trapped inside. At one point, one of the women hostages managed to phone a local radio station. Can you hear us? She asked. We're all going to be blown to hell. Then the line went dead. Over the next few days, there were attempts to negotiate with the Chechen militants. When that failed, Russian special forces did something no one expected.
I saw this horrific scene of the Russian security forces, after failing to negotiate, pumping gas into the building, which seemed like a brilliant idea. You just knock everybody out, except that it suffocated some of the people who were inside that they were trying to save.
At 5 a.m. on the third day of the siege, Russian commandos stormed the theatre and discovered the horrific consequences of what they'd done.
The cost of their liberation was high. The car park outside the theatre became a makeshift hospital and mortuary. Many of the hostages were killed during the operation.
130 hostages died during the siege. Most suffocated from the mystery gas pumped into the theatre by Russian special forces.
And I remember being really struck at the time Putin came out and apologized. Like, Putin never apologizes for anything. But he said we couldn't save everyone. I'm sorry.
The relief of the surviving hostages was mirrored today in the face of the Russian President Vladimir Putin as he visited them in hospital. But there are still many questions unanswered. How could this happen? And where will the rebels strike next?
That question, how could this happen, still hasn't been answered, even now, over 20 years later. But at the time, the main takeaway for Russians was that here they were again, being attacked by Chechen militants.
It's not to excuse anything the Russian state has done or to blame Chechnya for everything, but there were some bad terrorists who were at war with Russia at this time. I mean, Chechen terrorists, and they were Chechens, were able to leave the Caucasus, cross hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to Moscow, and then lead a heavily armed siege of a musical.
And so, the way many Russians looked at it, if Chechen militants had the brutality and ingenuity to pull off a siege in Moscow, then it wasn't a leap to think they could have bombed those 4 buildings back in '99. So, by the time of the government's trial of the accused apartment bombers, a lot of people had already reached a conclusion. It was Chechen militants. But given that, there's something very odd about this trial.
You know, one of the things that struck me at the time is that none of the people that were arrested or accused officially were Chechens. None of the people seemed to be from Chechnya.
Which is pretty striking.
It is.
It's worth repeating that. None of the men arrested or accused in relation to the apartment bombs were Chechen. That's despite the government's insistence that Chechen militants were to blame, and despite Vladimir Putin launching airstrikes on Chechnya just days after the attacks. So if they weren't Chechen, who were they? Well, it's not a simple question to answer. The government didn't release many details about their investigation on the bombs, so we did some digging into news reports, FSB statements, and the picture's confusing. Let's take it bomb by bomb. So for the first bomb, the one that exploded after a football match in southern Russia, 8 men from Dagestan, a republic next to Chechnya, were arrested. Those men had already been tried in court in early 2000 and found guilty. For the next 3 bombs, the FSB named 9 suspects. Again, none were Chechen. Instead, they were from neighbouring republics in the Caucasus, a mountainous area that spanned southern Russia, but they weren't from Chechnya.
I will say that in the Caucasus at the time, there were Islamic movements in all of the republics. It was a kind of a pan-Caucasian Islamic movement against Russia.
By 2003, 7 of those 9 suspects were either dead or in hiding, which left 2 men remaining. 2 men that the government tracked down in Georgia, then brought back to Russia to stand trial. Tell me about the trial.
As I recall, the trial was not open to the press, so you couldn't go. It happened more behind the scenes.
And was that very common?
When it comes to national security cases, yes, it's pretty common.
Which takes us back to Mikhail Trepashkin, the former FSB investigator turned whistleblower. Remember, because Trepashkin's representing one of the victims' families, he's allowed to go to the trial, to present new evidence. And he's planning on revealing what he thinks is a smoking gun, his discovery of the swapped sketch.
He meets with a Russian journalist and he shares his information of his suspicions of the case.
Here's journalist Scott Anderson again.
And then just a few days after that, Trepashkin is arrested. His apartment is raided by the FSB with his wife and 2 daughters there. And this time he's hauled off to prison.
So when the trial begins, and for the 2 months it runs, Trepashkin is behind bars, in custody. There's no one else who can present the evidence he found. And so his big discovery about the swapped police sketch and his theory that the original drawing of the suspected bomber looks like an FSB agent, it's never heard in court. Trepashkin's been silenced. We'll never know exactly what happened behind closed doors in the trial, but when it ends, reporters are allowed inside to hear the verdict. Journalists look on as the 2 suspects stand side by side in a glass box, ready to be sentenced. The 2 men are found guilty of terrorism, murder, illegal trafficking in explosives, and a string of other charges in relation to 3 of the 4 bombs, the ones in Moscow and Volgodonsk. The judge says the men were following orders from Chechen rebels, and he sentences the men to life in a high-security prison. When the men hear their sentence, they smile. "Why are you in such a good mood?" a reporter later asks. Because it's all lies, they say, and people laugh at lies. Outside the court, the men's lawyers tell reporters that their clients had admitted partial guilt, but only as middlemen. The men say they'd transported sacks of explosives to Moscow, thinking they were just bags of sugar. And that's it. The trial is over. The government announces the case closed and ends its criminal investigation into the apartment bombs. The files are then sealed, locked away for the next 75 years. As for Trepashkin, instead of disrupting the trial for the apartment bombs, he is now a suspect in his own trial, facing charges brought by the government.
So after he was arrested, he was tried in a closed court, no spectators.
The first charge, possession of an unlicensed gun, the judge quickly dismisses. But there's a second charge, which goes back to the raid on Trepashkin's apartment the previous year. Possession of classified FSB documents and some bullets. Bullets that Trepashkin insists were planted by the FSB. It's not much, but it's enough.
He was sentenced to 4 years in prison and sent off to a prison camp in the Ural Mountains.
So he'd made this huge gamble to take on this case. He'd found some extraordinary material, and then he's sent off to the middle of nowhere for 4 years.
That's right, yeah.
In an article about the court case, a journalist describes how after Trepashkin heard his verdict, his wife walked to a corner of the courtroom, turned her face to the wall, and wept. Later she told reporters, everyone knew what he knew, but why did he go out and say it? It was so stupid of him. Did he talk to you about what that was like?
It was a very harsh prison, and he was allowed very few visitors. I believe his wife came to see him twice.
In his prison diaries, Mikhail Trepashkin describes life in cell number 274. Prisoners had to take turns sleeping. When they weren't sleeping, they had to stand. There wasn't even room to sit. At one point, a journalist visited Trepashkin and asked if he was afraid. He said, "Yes, I am afraid. I'm afraid my children will grow up in a country without basic human rights. And I don't want them to be ashamed because their father stayed silent while the government destroyed the country." Meanwhile, as Trepashkin counts out the days in prison, in March 2004...
Now to Russia, where Vladimir Putin has won a landslide victory in the country's presidential election. But it wasn't exactly a triumph for democracy. That's according to the international observers who monitored the vote.
Vladimir Putin wins a second term as president. It's a landslide victory. He's won more than 70% of the vote. Russian state TV calls it a vote for stability. But international observers see something else. An election that was stacked from the start.
Mr. Putin has swept to a second term, but the Bush administration says under him authoritarian ways are creeping back to Russia, adding Mr. Putin's election wasn't fully democratic. In reply, Russia's president said he'd watched in amazement the failures in America's presidential elections 4 years ago, and they should perfect their own procedures before criticizing his.
With his victory, Vladimir Putin's grip tightens, and a new phase of his rule begins, more confident, more controlled. As for the apartment bombing story, the way the Kremlin handled it would become a template for how they managed future scandals too. When crises came, plane crashes, bombings, submarine disasters, the pattern would be the same. Move fast to control the narrative, flood the media with official versions of events, and seal investigations before awkward questions can be asked. Step by step, the message became clear. Not just for ordinary Russians, but to its journalists, judges, and investigators. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue. But there's one final twist in Mikhail Trepashkin's story. Something which shows just how far this fear of Russian retaliation had spread. It's something that happened to Scott Anderson after his reporting trip to Russia. the one where he met Trepashkin. Back in the US, Scott wrote up his story. And a few months later, in September 2009, exactly 10 years after the apartment bombs, Scott's piece appeared in GQ magazine.
The title was None Dare Call It a Conspiracy, the subtitle of Who is Behind the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings that accelerated Vladimir Putin's rise to power.
So pretty punchy.
Pretty punchy, yeah, pretty punchy.
And you'd expect a big reaction.
That's right. I expected quite a reaction. Instead, it was crickets.
I've read the piece. It reads like a thriller, charting every twist and turn of the apartment bombs and Trepashkin's story. It's well-researched, provocative, the kind of article that would normally get a lot of clicks.
But what was curious to me is that there was no mention of the article on the website.
So it appeared in the magazine and print, but not online.
Not online.
It made no sense to Scott. GQ had commissioned the story, published it in their magazine, so why not promote it properly? So he started asking around.
I was given this email that was from the chief law firm representing Condé Nast to all the leadership of Condé Nast and to the top editors of GQ.
Condé Nast is the media company that owns and publishes GQ.
Can we get you to read some of it?
Let me see if I can pull it up. It says, Condé Nast management has decided that the September issue of US GQ magazine containing Scott Anderson's article, Vladimir Putin's Dark Rise to Power, should not be distributed in Russia. To that end, the following steps should be taken. Number 1, subscription, newsstand, and other copies of the issue should not be sent to recipients in Russia. Number 2,
it's a long list of instructions, all to keep Scott Anderson's article out of Russia.
Number 4, the article should not be put on the GQ website nor on any website. Number 5, the article should not be put on or referred to on GQ's Facebook page, Twitter account, RSS feeds, iTunes.
And at the end of this long email, it simply says,
please feel free to call me to discuss.
Had anything like this happened to you ever before?
Never.
So what did you do?
So I actually went to National Public Radio and said, look, this is what's happening.
And it became a news story.
Normally when a magazine gets a big scoop, it shouts it to the world. But apparently not GQ.
It was covered on NPR in September 2009 by reporter David Folkenflik.
Now, I'm looking now at the September issue with Michael Jackson on the cover, and there's stuff about anti-erotics, smoking hot bride, the 25 most obnoxious colleges. I don't see any mention of this. This is a significant international piece. I couldn't find it anywhere on the internet.
It caused a little mini scandal, and in fact, like censorship usually does, it backfired because a group of independent people in Russia translated the article and published it online in Russia.
We wrote to Condé Nast to ask them to explain what happened. They said, quote, "We cannot verify Mr. Anderson's recollections from events 16 years ago, but at that time, Condé Nast's international offices operated independently, and it was not standard practice to publish US content overseas. In addition to print publication in 2009, the article was published many years ago on GQ.com, where it remains available for anyone to read today." And it's true. In 2017, Scott's piece was finally published on GQ.com. But back in 2009, when it was first published, Scott's article barely made a ripple, just like David Satter's article 10 years earlier, when he'd raised the same unsettling questions about the apartment bombs. And just like the dozens of articles written by journalists inside Russia, questioning the official story. And so, eventually, over the years, this story went quiet. Yes, there were rumours about the apartment bombs, of something dark and twisted at play, but not many major news organisations took it on. Which brings us to our final episode. We're going back to the reporters in this show who chased the story from the very beginning. 25 years on, what do they think really happened?
I would eat my hat if it turns out that the security services were not involved.
I would say that's a conspiracy theory. And I've read the evidence of journalists I respect who have come to a different conclusion. The timing doesn't work. The logic doesn't even work for me. But I know that there are people who believe that.
What's your take on it now? Who do you think plotted the bombs?
I'm not sure I'd give an answer. I think it's plausible that it was the FSB, but that's different from saying it was.
The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown. It's December 2010. We're in a ballroom in Russia. It's a glitzy night. Hundreds of guests in black tie, sitting at tables piled with flowers and champagne. A ripple moves through the room. A man in a tuxedo and open white shirt steps onto the stage and stands at the microphone. Vladimir Putin. 10 years since he became president, he's now one of the most powerful men on earth. The room falls silent. And then it begins.
I found my thrill on blueberry hill.
That's right. Putin, the ex-KGB hardman, is singing. Not a patriotic Russian anthem, but Blueberry Hill, a 1950s American classic. As he croons away, like a man auditioning for a late-night talent show, the camera pans across the audience. It's a charity gala packed with star power. Goldie Hawn and Monica Bellucci are clicking their fingers to the beat. Kevin Costner rises to his feet, swept up in the standing ovation. All eyes are locked on Putin as he sings. He's a little off-key, perhaps, but he's completely sure of himself. And this, right here, is the version of Putin the world sees in 2010. The showman, the statesman, the charmer who serenades Hollywood stars and walks into Western summits where no one asks uncomfortable questions. Questions about his critics who end up jailed or dead. Or about the apartment bombings and the doubts that lingered. For years, the world, by and large, looked away, and Vladimir Putin stayed centre stage, performing a carefully choreographed version of himself, while another story remained buried in the shadows. From the BBC, I'm Helena Merriman, and this is Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 7, Hindsight. Over the last 6 episodes, we've taken you deep into the story of the apartment bombs, the explosions, the investigations, and the unsettling questions. For months now, we've been talking to the journalists who first covered this story. The reporters who were there, on the ground, in the smoke, the chaos and confusion. And now, with over 25 years of distance, we're asking them a simple question. Who did they think bombed those 4 apartment buildings? Was it the Chechen militants the government blamed? Or was it an FSB plot to create a climate of fear so that one of their own, Vladimir Putin, could step in as the hard man the country needed and become president? Or is that nothing more than a wild conspiracy theory?
Who do you think was responsible for the apartment bombings?
Well, now the bombings were the work of professionals.
Here's journalist David Satter. We met him in episode 2. He's written about Russia for over 4 decades, and he was the first Western journalist to write an article suggesting that the FSB were involved. Since then, he's never been able to let this story go. Spent years trying to get to the bottom of it.
Terrorists can go with guns and shoot up a shopping center. But to blow up a building, you have to be a specialist. You have to have the right mix of explosives. You have to place the bomb next to the proper structural element in the building. And the people with that kind of expert knowledge are only in the FSB.
So that's David's first argument. Then he says, look at Ryazan, the city where police found a fifth bomb in the basement of an apartment building, and where the two suspected bombers turned out to be FSB agents.
When FSB agents were caught putting a bomb in a building in Ryazan, it was clear what was going on.
Remember, the FSB said this wasn't a bomb, just sacks of sugar, all part of a training exercise to test public vigilance. We've been staring at this story for months, and this is one of the hardest bits to make sense of. That in the middle of a wave of real bomb attacks across Russia, attacks that killed hundreds, that drove people to sleep outside in fear, that the government would choose this moment to plant fake bombs of its own.
Is there any world where that could make sense to do a training exercise?
No, for one thing, if it's a training exercise, why involving the civilian population, why were not the local authorities informed? Which is obligatory under the law.
And from everything we've read, it seems pretty clear that the local FSB in Ryazan had no idea that they were taking part in a training exercise. But the FSB leadership in Moscow has never changed their story. They've always maintained that Ryazan was just a drill. There's another moment that David Satter highlights.
The bombing in Volgodonsk had one peculiarity, and that was that it was announced in advance.
He's referring to that bizarre scene in the Russian parliament when the speaker said that an apartment in a town called Volgodonsk had been bombed 3 days before it was bombed.
You say the building's been blown up on the 13th and it's blown up on the 16th. What's going on in this country?
It's a conundrum, he says, that leaves you with two possible explanations.
It was just an unbelievable coincidence that the mistake became a reality 3 days later. Or somehow the plan to blow up the building in Volgodonsk was known in advance.
For David Satter, there's only one conclusion.
This was carried out by the FSB.
And for David, that then raises the question, what about Vladimir Putin? Because just weeks before those apartments exploded, Putin was running the FSB.
Putin was definitely part of it, because Putin was the head of the FSB.
It's a big claim, one Putin has always denied. In his authorized biography, published in April 2000, 6 months after the bombs, Putin says, "What? Blowing up our own apartment buildings? You know, that is really utter nonsense. It's totally insane. No one in the Russian special services would be capable of such a crime against his own people."
I think it's important to look at how people climb to power.
Here's Scott Anderson, veteran war correspondent who now writes for the New York Times magazine. He spent weeks with former FSB agent turned whistleblower Mikhail Trepashkin.
I compare it to the Reichstag fire that Hitler used to assume dictatorial powers. In both cases, this mysterious bombing of the Reichstag on one hand, the apartment bombs in Russia on the other, both men used that to propel themselves to even greater power. I mean, I can't go into a court of law and prove that Vladimir Putin ordered the apartment bombings. I do know, though, that if those bombings had been carried out by the FSB, it was on direct orders of Vladimir Putin, because that's the way that organization works. It would not have been freelancing by underlings.
For Scott, the fact that Putin benefited from the bombs establishes a motive. The attacks gave Putin the pretext for a full-scale war in Chechnya, he says, where Putin cast himself as the tough leader Russia had been waiting for. Putin's approval ratings for the presidency once 2%, then shot through the roof, and he became president just 6 months later.
From the first moment I knew about house bombings, I was sure that it's a foul play. The government is behind it.
Here's Yevgeny Kiselyov, former Director General of NTV, the network that put FSB officers and Ryazan residents face to face for that extraordinary TV show.
I would, so to say, eat my hat if it turns out that they were not involved. I am convinced that people with high connections in the government, in the security services, were involved.
Like David Satter and Scott Anderson, Yevgeny Kiselyov points to the strange events of Ryazan and Volgodonsk. And he adds something else.
There were a number of strange deaths and assassinations that to this day convince the people that a lot of foul play was involved in the whole story of apartment bombings.
Remember, one of the men on the independent commission investigating the bombs was shot dead outside his house. The other died a slow, agonizing death, which journalists at the time suspected was poisoning. Then there was Alexander Litvinenko, the FSB whistleblower poisoned on the streets of London. And that's not all, Yevgeny says. Just look at how Putin's behaved in the years since, how he wields power on the world stage. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. For Yevgeny, this is all part of a pattern of behavior.
Now, when we are looking at what Putin and his generals are doing in Ukraine, every sane person understands that they were capable of doing that 26 years ago because they don't care about people's lives.
So David Satter, Scott Anderson and Yevgeny Kiselyov all think that the evidence points to an FSB plot. But for other journalists looking at this, the story takes them somewhere else. Do you think this idea that the FSB orchestrated the attacks, would you say that's a conspiracy theory?
I would say that's a conspiracy theory. I don't think we can prove that.
Here's Stephen Lee Myers. He covered the trial of the apartment bombs when he was Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times and interviewed Putin a few years after he became president.
I've read the evidence, believe me, and there have been long inquiries done into it of journalists I respect who have come to a different conclusion.
First, he says, start with motive.
People say Putin needed a war to rise to power. That's the logic of it, right? This would somehow propel this unknown guy into leadership.
But Stephen doesn't buy it.
The logic doesn't work for me in the case of the Chechen war.
He points out that there'd been fighting between Chechen militants and Russian soldiers weeks before the apartment bombs. This was in the Republic of Dagestan, just next to Chechnya.
A large force of Chechen fighters launches this invasion into Dagestan to expand the Islamic State. And Putin, as prime minister, sent in troops and drove them out. So the war with Chechnya had already started again. And Russian people, not necessarily everyone in the political elite, were very happy to see the Russians go in there and beat the hell out of them.
As Stephen sees it, Putin didn't need to bomb 4 apartments to justify a new war against Chechnya. In his view, that war had already begun. Which is why for Stephen, the motive for Chechen militants looks more straightforward. He points to what was happening in 1999, in the months before the bombs. The Kremlin's grip on Chechnya was slipping, and Boris Yeltsin's government was unraveling.
So he was ill, and the country was ill. And I think that the Chechens, and I'm speculating now, saw that this was a moment of weakness in the Russian state, and that this was going to be their best chance where they could solidify their control, not only of the Republic of Chechnya, but a broader Islamic state. You have to get in the mind of a terrorist, and I don't think they think like you and I do. I think they're like, we're going to strike the enemy and weaken it while it's down, and they don't think about the consequences. And I think that it wasn't beyond them to carry out these kinds of terrorist attacks.
Just look at the attacks they've carried out in Russia over the years, he says. There was that siege in the Moscow theatre in 2002, the one where Chechen gunmen took more than 900 people hostage. 2 years later, in 2004, 2 passenger planes were attacked by Islamist militants who linked themselves to the Chechen cause.
2 airplanes flying across Russia blew up in midair. And everybody forgets that. Each one of those killed 100 and some people, as I recall.
And the explosives found in the plane wreckage, according to the FSB, it was hexagon. The same explosive used in at least one of the apartment bombs. So the idea we've heard in this series, that Chechen militants couldn't possibly get hold of hexagon, well, either they could, or we're going to need a second season to investigate those aircraft bombings. And the same year, 2004, a Chechen suicide bomber struck the Moscow metro during rush hour, killing over 40 people. And then
they seized a school of kids and their parents in Beslan, and that also ended in a massacre with hundreds of kids dying. I mean, it was heartbreaking.
So for Stephen Lee Myers, Chechen militants not only had a plausible motive for the apartment bombings, it also fits their record of violent attacks inside Russia. Who do you think blew up those apartments?
I believe that some people involved in the Islamic extremist cause related to or adjacent to the war in Chechnya were definitely involved.
So where does this leave us? There are competing arguments that point in very different directions. One leads to the FSB, the other to militants from Chechnya or elsewhere in the region. But for some of the reporters we spoke to, the picture is still so murky that it's too hard to make a call either way.
What's your take on it now? Who do you think plotted the bombs?
I'm not sure I'd give an answer. I think it's plausible that it was the FSB, but that's different from saying it was, and that there's proof about it.
Here's former BBC security correspondent Gordon Correra.
There are so many odd elements to what happened. I mean, it did seem almost too much, given the death toll from those bombings, that it was the FSB. I think that was the view then. But the more you look at it, the more you kind of wonder. So I don't think I would give a definitive answer. But plausible, yes. And I think at the time, early 2000s, there was more scepticism of it. And I think that scepticism has faded over the years, because I think the more you learn about Putin and about the Russian security services and what they're capable of, the more you go, maybe it isn't as quite as outlandish a claim as people thought. Is there proof? I've not seen definitive proof, but I think there's less scepticism now than there was then.
It's now been over 25 years since the bombings. When you look back on them now, what do you make of them? How do you think about them?
I just think of Ryazan.
That's Andrew Harding, the BBC's correspondent in Moscow when those 4 apartment buildings were bombed. And he's still puzzling over what happened in Ryazan, that 5th bomb which the FSB said was part of a drill. Which is confusing because, at first, the local FSB said it was real.
They were the ones who did the tests. They were the ones who said, this ain't sugar. This is a genuine thing.
So Andrew says he understands why some people see what happened in Ryazan as evidence of FSB involvement.
On the one hand, it just made absolute sense. On the other hand, it just felt too awful to believe.
But just as he has no clear answers about the FSB, he's also torn about the role Chechen militants might have played. And he's in a good position to know. In fact, of all the journalists we've spoken to for this series, Andrew Harding has spent the most time with Chechen militants, including with their notorious commander, Shamil Basayev.
He was perhaps the most intrepid, the most aggressive rebel fighter.
Do you think he was the kind of person that could have been behind something like this?
Yeah. I mean, he's shown no qualms about taking civilian hostages. I think civilian hostages were more a means to an end. So in that way, I don't think the apartment bombings up in Moscow were a very likely type of Chechen project. But this was a man with a track record of killing Russian civilians. There was a baked-in sense of contempt for Russia. He felt Russia was rotten, that Russia needed more than just to be pushed out of Chechnya, that this was an evil empire. And so I can see that if an opportunity presented itself to cause agony in Moscow, that he could have taken that opportunity. I have no evidence for that, but I don't see it as impossible at all.
So for Andrew Harding, 25 years on, the picture still isn't clear. But perhaps there's another way to look at this story. So far, we've been asking whether the FSB or Chechen militants were responsible. What if that's the wrong question? What if we're guilty of doing something journalists often do, looking for a neat story with a single mastermind pulling all the strings? What if it wasn't the FSB or the Chechens? What if it was both?
What's always puzzled me was the one bomb that didn't go off, Ryazan. And this is really what gave birth to the conspiracy theories.
Here's the New York Times' Stephen Lee Myers again, the journalist who doesn't buy the idea that Putin and the FSB orchestrated the whole thing.
I've puzzled over this, and I did a lot of reporting to try to resolve this original sin of the Putin years. And I came away with the conclusion that there were certainly FSB people involved. Corruption in the FSB and the law enforcement generally in Russia at the time was extraordinary. You can't underestimate it. So it would not surprise me to know that somebody from the FSB working with people who are known terrorists would take money to do something like this. Cold-bloodedly, blowing up an apartment building full of civilians. That's not to say that the FSB orchestrated it. So I haven't seen evidence of a government conspiracy that has persuaded me that the government was behind this. But I know that there are people who believe that. And I think that the truth is probably somewhere in between.
Corruption, as Stephen says, was rampant in the FSB. So one possibility is that individual FSB officers were involved in the bombs without being part of a grand FSB plot. This could explain some of the strange things that went on after Ryazan. Perhaps the FSB wasn't protecting people at the top, but covering up for a few corrupt officers further down.
It's possible that we don't know what happened because they didn't want to expose the complicity of corrupt people who, took a bribe and looked the other way. And, they're kind of protecting their own and the reputation of the security services over the truth.
Plus, he says, it might also explain the secrecy surrounding the government's investigation into the bombs.
Looking back now, you see that this is a government that hides its secrets. And I believe that's deliberate. I believe that there was something they had to hide. You didn't have the transparency you would expect or would hope to have that would put to rest the answers of what really happened. An open trial of the evidence that linked these bombings to certain people might have convinced people, but we didn't ever have that.
Did you say that's because you think there was something they were trying to hide?
Absolutely, there's something that they haven't told us about this. And a lot of what we should know has been classified or buried or covered up. And we see this over and over and over again in Russia. Events that would demand a public inquiry in democratic societies are simply covered up. And it's not always because there's necessarily some nefarious government conspiracy behind them. It's just they don't have that tradition of leveling with their own people. They cover things up.
That's the interesting point, isn't it? That some people would see that as perhaps a strong indication of a conspiracy theory.
Yeah. And that's the tension that I've always felt around this particular question. It's part of the origin story of Vladimir Putin. It's intertwined with his arrival on the scene as the future leader. And I think until you can persuade enough people that you know what really did happen, you're always going to have that kind of murky stain, if you will, on Putin's rule.
We should add there are other theories too, beyond the FSB and Chechen militants. Some have pointed the finger at Boris Berezovsky, the oligarch who helped manoeuvre Putin into the presidency before falling out with him and fleeing to London, where he later funded Alexander Litvinenko's book on the bombings. Berezovsky was well connected in Chechnya, the argument goes, and could have been part of a wider plot. Others think the attackers could have been militants from elsewhere in the region, and it's also possible that not all 4 bombings were carried out by the same people. This is a story that's never been short of theories, but a definitive answer feels just out of reach. But what if, one day, new conclusive evidence came to light that upturned the official narrative?
If someone were to find proof that the FSB, indeed Putin, was involved, do you think it would change much, given where we are now?
The trouble is now you could have video evidence, you could have confessions, you could go back in time and show the world. But we live in an age now where that wouldn't be enough. Russia is in a space now where it wouldn't be enough to change anything.
And actually, in some ways, that, for me, is perhaps the more profound conclusion, that nothing would change.
Not a thing.
We may never know exactly what happened back in 1999. The evidence simply isn't there, or no longer exists, to prove the case conclusively, one way or the other. So instead, we're left with a different question. Having spent months digging into this story, it's clear some things were missed, or at least not given the attention they deserved. Like Ryazan. Why didn't more Western journalists ask questions about what happened there sooner? And Volgodonsk, the Speaker of the Russian Parliament naming the city where a bomb would go off 3 days before it was bombed. Of course, we now have the benefit of hindsight. But for the journalists who first covered this story, looking back at it now, a quarter of a century later, do they have regrets? Do they wish they'd asked different questions before the story and the man at its centre slipped beyond reach? Here's Yevgeny Kiselyov again.
When we were trying to convince our Western colleagues that Putin is leading Russia in the wrong direction, many people looked at us as if we are conspiracy theorists.
Do you think that one of the reasons that more Western reporters didn't look into this at the time, because many Russians did, was that it just felt so unbelievable that the FSB could be behind a campaign to bomb its own people?
I think we were distracted by the war, which started very quickly.
Andrew Harding again.
I think it's quite painful to confront that. There were good reporters who did good reporting. All I can say is I think we should have done. We should have covered it more, and we didn't. You know, it makes you think, and it's a good reminder of how easy it is to fall into patterns in reporting, even when one thinks one's being correct and cautious. That there's the sort of consensus thinking, the kind of group think, because I don't think we did anything bad or wrong. I think there were some missed opportunities, yeah.
I think it's a problem of imagination.
David Satter again.
Understanding Russia is very easy, but it requires you to do something that's very hard. You have to believe the unbelievable. But how many people, how many journalists, how many diplomats, how many political leaders are equipped to believe the unbelievable?
Well, look at where I'd come from as someone born in 1965.
Here's BBC journalist Jeremy Vine. He covered that press conference where Boris Berezovsky blamed the FSB and Putin for the bombs, allegations that most journalists in the room dismissed as too wild to take seriously. He says we have to remember the moment Putin emerged, at a time when it seemed Russia was finally on its way to democracy, to becoming a normal country.
For the whole of my childhood and my teenage years, I was lying in bed in Cheam in Surrey thinking I had Russian nuclear missiles pointed at my head and they could go off at any time. And then along comes Gorbachev and he seems wonderful. And then he's sort of deposed and in comes Yeltsin, who, while constantly drunk, is also benign. And so forgive us, my generation, for thinking we're on a flight path into Russia becoming normal. So it's that brilliant hindsight thing that you're doing on this podcast, which is enabling me to see with a rearview mirror what I could not see on the day.
It is perhaps an unfair exercise to shine a spotlight on the reporters we've spoken to for this series, asking them what they missed 25 years ago. These reporters who picked through the rubble, chased leads in the dark, trying to make sense of a country tilting under their feet. They missed things, of course they did. And we'll have missed things too.
A good friend of mine who's a historian told me once, I'm so glad I don't have to do what you do, which is talk about people who are still alive.
Here's Stephen Lee Myers again.
You know, he liked the idea that in history, the events are past and they don't change. And there are records of this that a historian will hopefully someday have. But it won't be soon, and it won't be as long as this government is in control.
Stephen's friend says he prefers history because the events have passed and don't change. But our understanding of past events does change, with perspective, and as new facts emerge. So we should be clear. What you've heard here is only a second draft of history, written with gaps and doubts. In another 25 years, maybe someone else will come along and do it better. Ask the questions we didn't yet know to ask. But whatever the truth about the bombings, there's no doubt that Russia did change profoundly when Vladimir Putin became president. Right now, the country is closing in on itself. Independent newsrooms shut down, reporters in exile, Western news sites blocked, and Facebook, Instagram and X, the platforms that once connected Russians to the outside world, have been banned. And yet, here's a twist we didn't expect. Only a couple of years ago, back in 2024, a concert hall in Moscow was attacked. Rumours swirled, and as Russians turned to the internet, trying to make sense of what happened, again and again, the same two words appeared in their searches. Ryazan, sugar. Which tells you something. This story, even in Russia today, is not just history. It's still very much alive. The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier, and the executive editor is Annie Brown. Sound by Eloise Whitmore, archive research by Samira Chowdhury, the production manager is Joe Kyle, and the production coordinator is Liz Toohey. The commissioners are Dan Clark for BBC Radio 4 and Richard Knight for BBC Studios.